Hey kids! This is a chapter from The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism by A Philosophical and Sociological Analysis by Z.A. Jordan. It's chapter 3. And the sections of this chapter include section 1. This chapter is titled The Influence of Hegel's Philosophy. Section 1 is titled The Various Interpretations of the Relation of Marx to Hegel. 2. Marx's Attitude towards Hegel. 3. Engels' Attitude towards Hegel. 4. Marx's Indebtedness to Hegel. 5. The Hegelian Revival in the Philosophy of Engels. All right. Here we go. In his study From Hegel to Marx, Sidney Hook observed that to juxtapose the names of Hegel and Marx is to raise a challenging problem in the history of philosophical thought, and not simply to state a recognized relationship or a logical connection. This opinion is confirmed by the fact that there is a striking lack of consensus in the evaluation of Marx's relation to Hegel. At one extreme, there are those who see a pervasive and overwhelming influence of Hegel's thought upon Marx's philosophical development and beliefs. Their point of view has recently been expressed in the neat formula, quote, Marx is unthinkable without Hegel, end quote. Since Marx never escaped from the domination of Hegelian philosophy, in a certain sense, he remained a Hegelian throughout his life. Footnote. R. Heiss, Die großen Dialectiker des 19. Jahrhunderts, pages 324 to 325. Franz Mehring, the first biographer of Marx, said that Marx started as a pupil of Hegel to become a Feuerbachian, but as he later moved beyond Feuerbach, he went back to Hegel. See Franz Mehring, Karl Marx. And footnote. Marx remained a Hegelian in spite of the fact that he was a materialist and Hegel an idealist. Ever since Engels made this point, dialectics provided the latent bond uniting Hegel and Marx over and beyond their manifest differences. Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin are the most prominent representatives of the Verhegelung, of the Hegelizing interpretation of the philosophy of Marx. This view is also supported by some Western historians of philosophy. To give two recent examples, Gustav A. Vetter and Robert C. Tucker maintain that Marx's doctrine is Hegel's, quote, metaphysics of identity, end quote, turned upside down, or that, quote, Marxism may be seen as Hegelianism inverted, end quote. It says that Gustav A. Vetter was an Austrian historian. He wrote a book titled Dialectical Materialism, A History and Systematic Survey of Philosophy in the Soviet Union. According to German Wikipedia, Gustav Andreas Vetter lived from 1911 to 1991, was an Austrian historian of philosophy. He belonged to the Jesuit order from 1936 and worked on the philosophy and history of the Soviet Union. Vetter entered the Collegium Russicum in Rome and was its rector between 1947 and 1954. At Christmas 1935, he was ordained a priest according to the Byzantine Slavic rite. He obtained a doctorate from the Pontifical Georgian University. From 1957 in the 70s, he was professor of the history of Russian philosophy at the Pontifical Oriental Institute and at the Gregorian University. His books include Dialectical Materialism, Its History and Its System in the Soviet Union. These are all in German, by the way. Philosophy and Natural Science in the Soviet Union, Soviet Ideology Today, together with Wolfgang Leonhardt, and Inversion of Hegel, Principles and Origins of Soviet Philosophy. So that's A. Vetter, and Robert C. Tucker. I kind of know who Robert C. Tucker is, but I want to see if there's anything juicy or interesting about in his online biography. Robert C. Tucker lived from 1918 to 2010 and was an American political scientist and historian. Tucker is best remembered as a biographer of Joseph Stalin and as an analyst of the Soviet political system, which he saw as dynamic rather than unchanging. So, footnote, G.A. Vetter, D. Umkehrung Hegels, and R.C. Tucker, Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx. End footnote. At the other extreme, there are the adherents of the opinion that there is a complete break of philosophical continuity between Hegel and Marx. According to Karl Löwit, who I think is an intellectual historian, Marx and Kierkegaard were Hegel's most prominent opponents. Together they succeeded in destroying his entire intellectual world. Karl Löwit lived from 1897 to 1973 and was a German philosopher in the phenomenological tradition. A student of Husserl and Heidegger, he was one of the most prolific German philosophers of the 20th century. He is known for his two books, From Hegel to Nietzsche, which describes the decline of German classical philosophy, and Meaning in History, which challenges the modern, secular, progressive narrative of history, which seeks to ground the meaning of history itself. So that's Karl Löwit. Footnote, Karl Löwit von Hegel zu Nietzsche. Back to the text. And footnote, after Hegel's death, wrote Herbert Marcuse, quote, the history of Hegelianism became the history of a struggle against Hegel, in which he was used as a symbol for all that the new intellectual efforts opposed, end quote. The true content of Hegelian philosophy was taken over by Marx, but its historical heritage consisted solely in its critical tendencies which Marx applied to social theory and practice. Marx accepted Hegel's demonstration that the material and spiritual powers of mankind achieved a stage of maturity. This made it possible to reorganize social and political reality in accordance with the requirements of reason. It is not possible, however, to show the transformation of the Hegelian categories into those to be found in Marx. The framework and particular concepts of the Marxian doctrine cannot be derived from the theories either of Hegel or of Feuerbach. See Herbert Marcuse, Reason and Revolution. The Hegelianizing approach to the philosophy of Marx has been rejected by an array of distinguished thinkers and writers, while recognizing the fact that during a relatively short period in his youth, Marx was indeed a Hegelian. They deny that his surrender to the intellectual fashion of the day left any permanent traces in his mind or inspired his mature views. No philosophical relationship as distinct from a historical connection links Hegel and Marx. Finally, there's the third group of the exponents of Marx's doctrine who believe that in his development, from the acceptance of Hegelian philosophy to the formulation of his own point of view, both the continuity and the break with Hegel can be discovered. Marx was a Hegelian for a time, but then ceased to be one. He did not remain unaffected by his study of Hegelian philosophy, but his views are not a simple Umkehrung of those of Hegel. In order to discover what Marx had borrowed from Hegel as a historical and logical analysis is necessary, because Marx expressed Hegel's ideas in terms of a different philosophical framework before introducing them into his own system. Sidney Hook's From Hegel to Marx is an outstanding instance of this approach. Section 1. The various interpretations of the relation of Marx to Hegel. Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin, who shared the view of the importance of Hegel for the philosophy of Marx, were all staunch and enthusiastic admirers of Hegel. Each of them left a comprehensive testimony to his high esteem of the Hegelian system, to his respectful appreciation of Hegel's insight and vision, encyclopedic knowledge, and breadth of view. Footnote. Engels discussed the relation of Marx to Hegel in Anti-Düring, Ludwig Feuerbach, Dialectics of Nature, and in some smaller contributions. in Karl Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which is a review of that book by Engels. In particular, Plekhanov's main contribution to this subject is the essay Zu Hegels Sechzigsten Todestag, first published in Die Neue Zeit in 1891, and Lenin's is, of course, his philosophical notebooks. End footnote. Within the Marxian tradition, the combined impact of the opinions of Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin has played a decisive role in the evaluation of Hegelian philosophy and of its part in the formation of the Marxian doctrine. Consequently, Hegel came to be regarded as the most important thinker before Marx, equaled only by Aristotle and surpassed only by Marx himself. According to Engels, these three thinkers alone closely investigated dialectics and the evolutionary processes occurring in nature and society, thereby establishing a dynamic worldview that replaced the familiar static outlook. Footnote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Aristotle owes the distinction of being considered an equal of Hegel to his classification of the various kinds of change, movement, to his striking analysis of Genesis, and to his belief that the universal is the source and the first principle of all things. Aristotle's doctrine of the universal greatly influenced Hegel, and through Hegel impressed Engels. End footnote. However, only Hegel gave to Aristotle's masterly conception of nature its distinctive and consistent form. Once Hegel's idealist starting point and his partiality to a fact-defying system are set aside, there remains Hegelian dialectics, both a system of the most general laws of the universe and a set of the rules of procedure on which modern materialism is based. Footnote. See Engels' Dialectics of Nature. It was Engels' opinion, endorsed by Lenin, and without German idealist philosophy, particularly that of Hegel, quote, German scientific socialism, would never have come into being, end quote. Footnote. See Engels' introduction to the first German edition of Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, and Lenin's, quote, Friedrich Engels. Frederick Engels, excuse me. The Hegelian system had been, end footnote, the Hegelian system had been the Hegelian system had epoch-making merits and achievements to its credit. It was, quote, the last and most consummate form of philosophy, end quote, after which, quote, all philosophy collapsed, end quote, bequeathed the conception that, quote, the natural, historical, and intellectual world moves and transforms itself endlessly in a constant process of becoming and passing away, end quote. The legacy bequeathed by Hegelian philosophy to its successors required a search for the laws of motion of this process of transformation, a task taken up and successfully accomplished by Marx. Footnote. Engels' Anti-Düring. See Karl Marx, page 61, for a later formulation of the same idea. End footnote. Without knowledge of Hegelian philosophy, wrote Plekhanov, it is difficult to grasp the method of Marx, who is the true successor of Hegel. In Hegel's hands, dialectics became, quote, the most powerful scientific weapon, end quote, making Hegel, quote, the founder of the most progressive ideas of today, end quote. Quote, this idealist of genius, end quote, wrote Plekhanov, quote, this greatest of idealists seems to have set himself the task of clearing the road for materialism, end quote. Plekhanov. Lenin shared the views of Engels and Plekhanov. He felt that Hegel excelled in profundity many scientists and scholars of his time, and described his own work as the, quote, continuation of the work of Hegel and Marx, end quote. He was convinced that the study of the former was a difficult but necessary approach to the understanding of the latter. The seeds of historical materialism exist in an embryo in Hegel. Footnote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. that Hegel's philosophy of right is materialistic in approach, and that Hegel was the first to analyze the role of the, quote, material relations, end quote, in the structure of society is a fact emphasized by R. Heiss, Die großen Dialectiker des 19. Jahrhunderts, page 180 to 92. R. Heiss went as far as to say that, quote, Marx only said explicitly what Hegel already recognized, end quote. Marx nur gesagt hat, was Hegel schon erkannt hat. Heiss failed to see that, unlike Marx, Hegel deduced social and economic reality from ideas and not the other way around. The fact that Hegel, or, for that matter, Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonians, Sismondi or Proudhon, spoke of the fundamental character of the economic order in a rational organization of society, did not imply that they were precursors of historical materialism. Although they recognized the importance of economic factors in social life, they differed essentially from Marx, because they regarded them as an effect rather than a cause. Their approach to the problems of history and society and their whole way of thinking was incompatible with historical materialism. End footnote. More generally, Engels was right when he said that, quote, Hegel's system was materialism turned upside down, end quote. According to Lenin, the inversion of materialism attributed to Hegel applies not only to the content but also to the method of Hegel's philosophy, where Hegel detected the dialectics of things and the dialectics of concepts. The basis of Marx's method was Hegelian dialectics materialistically conceived. Quote, it is impossible to understand capital, end quote, Lenin observed, quote, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic, ... Consequently, half a century later, none of the Marxists understood Marx, end quote. Lenin. There's a footnote that I missed. Engels spoke of the Hegelian system as mercilessly representing, quote, a materialism idealistically turned upside down in the method and content, end quote. Ludwig Feuerbach. Numerous historians of philosophy accepted Engels' observation as an incisive and true description of the relation of Marx to Hegel. It is doubtful, however, whether the substitution of the asymmetric genetic relation XRY, where X stands for matter and Y for spirit or mind, for the asymmetric genetic relation YRX can best be described as turning Hegel upside down. The operation is of quite a different nature, one to which Engels' phrase does not do justice. End footnote. The fact that Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin had a tremendous admiration for Hegel had and continues to have important implications for the interpretation of Marxian philosophy by its supporters. The feeling is widespread among them that Marxian philosophy is bound to lose its distinctive features if it is torn away from its Hegelian background. This view is also shared by some historians of social and political ideas. They feel that the framework of Marx's historical and sociological theories is, quote, undeviatingly Hegelian, end quote, even though the turn he gave, quote, to the master's doctrine was one which the latter would doubtless have been the first to repudiate, end quote. Asaya Berlin, Karl Marx. See also H.J. Lasky, Communism. End footnote. In both cases, the firm conviction that the Hegelian categories constitute an essential part of Marx's philosophy leads to some strange consequences, since the influence of Hegel upon Marx, which the exponents under discussion believe to have been decisive, is apparent above all, on the linguistic level. The hidden Hegelian significance of Marxian beliefs has to be revealed by some sort of depth analysis. Robert C. Tucker tried to demonstrate that the true meaning of what Marx wrote is quite different from what he actually said. Marx's basic sociological, economic, and political doctrines have a speculative and not an empirical origin. They were based on the development of German philosophy and theology from Immanuel Kant to Ludwig Feuerbach, were derived from the philosophy and theology of Hegel, and remained essentially an eschatology and a theology. Quote, Marx founded Marxism in an outburst of Hegelizing, end quote. End quote, created his own system on the basis of a misreading of Hegel, end quote. R.C. Tucker, Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx. Feuerbach showed that Hegel's conception of history as a process of self-realization of God in the self-consciousness of mankind was an inverted representation of man, alienated from himself in religion. Marx believed that Feuerbach erred by confining himself to theology, since Hegel really tried to express the self-estrangement of man in all his productive activity, including the process of labor. Marx reached his political economy by, quote, the mental process of turning Hegel upside down in accordance with Feuerbach's prescription, end quote. Even Capital, ostensibly a book about economics and the capitalist system, has perhaps more in common with the phenomenology of mind than with the wealth of nations. R.C. Tucker. Marx wished to create a, quote, Hegelianism of the marketplace, in which not spirit but man strives for self-realization through the struggle of a divided self to resolve its inner conflict and recover its lost unity, end quote. R.C. Tucker, Marxism, is it religion? To say that Marxian doctrines are but an inversion of the Hegelian theological and mystical idea of the absolute spirit, which, divided against itself, strives for self-realization, and finally, having completed its succession of inner transformations through history, attains redemption, is a conclusion apparently supported by its own inherent logic. Any view which contains its own confirmation is always suspect, and this rule applies to the exegesis in question. It is possible to give a theological interpretation of a naturalistic system, but as such as that of Marx, and find suitable quotation in its support. But such illustrations are methodologically unsatisfactory, and they do not assume interpretive adequacy. An interpretation is adequate if it does justice to all the main theses of the interpreted systems, without resorting to the device of conferring upon them a latent esoteric meaning in substitution for their manifest exoteric meaning, that is, for what they in fact state. The interpretation of Marxian theories as inverted Hegelianism does not seem to pass this crucial test of adequacy. It seems, for instance, utterly erroneous to argue that the alienation of man from himself, as described by Marx as a quasi-religious experience resulting from the dissociation of the self from the double life, metaphysically or theologically conceived, of a divided human being, and not a social phenomenon produced by the division of labor, technical change, and the class structure of society. Footnote. It should be observed that the meaning of the term, quote, estrangement, Entfremdung, which in economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, and Zur Judenfrage, the Jewish question, is a purely Hegelian metaphysical concept that acquires a definite sociological and empirical sense in the German ideology. See H. Popitz, Der Entfremdete Mensch, and for a more detailed discussion, see Z.A. Jordan, Socialism, Alienation, and Political Power. Marx retained the empirical sociological concept of alienation in Capital, where it reappears in a new linguistic guise and is designated by such terms as, quote, fetishism, quote, dehumanization, or, quote, exploitation. C. E. Kamenka, The Ethical Foundations of Marxism, pages 144 to 45. I have a piece by, I think it's Eugene Kamenka, on this channel. For Hegel, Entfremdung signified a metaphysical fact that the world of objects, originally the product of man's spiritual activity, becomes independent of man, alienating and frustrating his strivings and desires. One of the main objectives of Hegel's philosophy was to show how man can reconquer the estranged reality and reestablish the lost unity of thought and reality. The alienation through productive labor is in Hegel an inevitable result of the integration of individual activities into an organized whole in a commodity-producing society, in which mechanization makes the individual more and more powerless and subjugated to his labor. This metaphysical concept of Entfremde is only one of which Marx made use in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. For the Hegelian concept of alienation, see Herbert Marcuse, Reason and Revolution, pages 34 to 36 and 78 to 79. End footnote. In Marx's time, some perceptive minds were fully aware of the fact that the increasing specialization and division of labor were breaking up society into innumerable small fractions and were responsible for much social, moral, and intellectual hardship, which, unless remedied, would be a serious abatement from the benefits of the advance of civilization. Footnote. See Alex de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, and Comte Coeur, and John Stuart Mill, or James, I don't know, is it James Stuart Mill? I don't know. J.S. Mill, Auguste Comte, and Positivism. End footnote. Marx fully agreed with this view. Similarly, he had no patience with the thinkers who believed that theology rather than sociology provided the key to the understanding of history and society. In a reference to the brothers Bauer and Hegel and the Holy Family, Marx said that men are neither gods nor potential gods. On the contrary, men are determined in what they are and do by the social conditions of their life. In the German ideology, Marx spoke scornfully of the dominance of religious ideas in German philosophical criticism, from David Strauss to Max Stirner, and of the futility of reducing metaphysical, moral, political, and other problems to religious or theological conceptions in whose terms they were to be discussed and solved. David Strauss, often written as D.F. Strauss, lived from 1808 to 1874, was a German liberal Protestant theologian and writer who influenced Christian Europe with his portrayal of the, quote, historical Jesus, end quote, whose divine nature he explored via myth. Strauss conceived of myths as expressions of truths, as opposed to the modern shorthand of myth for, quote, falsity, end quote. Strauss did not deny Jesus' divine nature. His work was connected to the Tübingen School, which revolutionized study of the New Testament, early Christianity, and ancient religions. Strauss was a pioneer in the historical investigation of Jesus. Back to the text. Footnote. German ideology. End footnote. It is difficult to reconcile Marx's attack on theology in its mystical or secular form, represented by Hegel and the young Hegelians respectively, with Marx's theologian or philosopher obsessed by a religious and moral vision of reality. Finally, Capital is clearly what it claims to be, an empirical rather than a speculative work, a social history and a sociological and economic analysis of the capitalist system. To describe it as a chapter in the history of the self-creation or self-realization of man in the process of productive labor is to use an irrelevant and confusing mode of expression. At the other extreme of the spectrum of opinions concerning the relation to Hegel to Marx are those who regard the Hegelizing interpretation of Marx's doctrines either as grossly exaggerated or even as entirely wrong. According to Benedetto Croce, Marx took from Hegel only his phraseology. Moreover, he adopted it, quote, with a freedom that at times seems not to lack an element of mockery, end quote. Benedetto Croce. Footnote. Benedetto Croce, Historical Materialism and the Economics of Karl Marx. End footnote. Karl Löwit objected to the young Hegelians in general for having reduced Hegel's conceptual dialectics to a stylistic device. Georg Plekhanov went even further by describing the Hegelianism of the left as a Saint-Simonisme Hegelianisme, Hegelianice, that is, Saint-Simonism expressed in Hegelian terms. Georg Plekhanov lived from 1894 to 1965, was a Russian-born French sociologist and jurist, one of the leading sociologists of his times. He was a specialist of the sociology of knowledge. In 1944, he founded the journal Cahiers, so I guess it's Cahiers Internationaux de Sociologie. He held a chair in sociology at the Sorbonne in Paris. An outspoken advocate of Algerian decolonization, Gurvich and his wife were the victim of terrorist attack by the far-right nationalist group LOAS on June 22, 1962. Their apartment was destroyed by a bomb, and they took refuge for a time at the house of painter Marc Chagall. Gurvich is an important figure in the development of sociology of law. Like other legal sociologists, Gurvich insisted that law is not merely the rules or decisions produced, interpreted, and enforced by agencies of the state, such as legislatures, courts, and police. Groups and communities of various kinds, whether formally structured or informally organized, produce regulation for themselves and others, which can properly be considered law from a sociological standpoint. Gurvich's legal pluralism is, however, far more rigorous and radical than that of most legal sociologists, and locates an immense variety of types of law in the various kinds of sociality or social interaction that he distinguishes in his writings. He saw the need to stress the reality and significance of social law and social rights, in opposition to what he termed individual law. His Bill of Social Rights, drafted at the end of World War II, is an attempt to state a blueprint of a legal framework of social law for a post-war world in which the idea of human rights had become newly powerful. The sociologist and ideologue of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Ali Shariati, studied under Gurvich in the 1960s during his studies in France at the University of Sorbonne. So that's Georg Gurvich. Back to the text. Footnote. Karl Leuwitt, Von Hegel sur Nietzsche, G. Gurvich, La vocation actuelle de la sociologie, tome 2. Gurvich seems to follow Engels' definition of, quote, true socialism as a, quote, translation of French socialist phraseology into corrupt Hegelian German, end quote. End footnote. That Hegel's influence upon Marx was terminological rather than conceptual is a view more or less common to all the writers of the anti-Hegelian orientation. Marx's predilection for the obscure language of Hegel and his pseudo-technical vocabulary, rich in oracular and mystical intimations, is plain and clear. It makes some of his early writings hardly readable and some later works more involved and difficult to understand than was necessary. That the common vocabulary of Hegel and Marx should be distinguished from their alleged conceptual affinity is a view which can be supported by what Marx himself said on the matter in the preface to the second German edition of Capital. Marx confessed that, having been angered by the young Hegelians' contemptuous silence over Hegel, quote, I openly avowed myself the pupil of that mighty thinker, and even here and there, coquetted with the modes of expression peculiar to him, end quote. Marx. Werner Sombart believed that Marx never took anything from Hegel without having first expurgated it from the, quote, conceptual mythology, end quote, Begriffsmythologie, characteristic of Hegel. But Sombart was certain that after this expurgation had been accomplished, nothing essentially Hegelian remained in what Marx borrowed from Hegel. In this respect, Sombart differed, for instance, from Georg Lukács. Consequently, Sombart had no doubt whatsoever that Marx had nothing in common with the spirit of Hegelian philosophy. Quote, Marx often made use of Hegel's jargon and took over from him very many particular isolated ideas, but basically he is not in the least related to Hegel. Metaphysically, ontologically, historiosophically, in brief, in all decisive respects, Marx stands in the sharpest opposition to Hegel. End quote. Werner Sombart, Der proletarische Sozialismus. Sombart is not alone in his belief that Marx completely broke with the whole of Hegel's philosophy. See Korsch, Karl Marx. End footnote. Benedetto Croce's impressionistic observations on the relation of Marx to Hegel were further elaborated by Karl Vorländer. Wikipedia says Karl Furländer lived from 1860 to 1928 and was a German neo-Kantian philosopher taught at Solingen. He published various studies and editions of the works of Immanuel Kant, including studies of the relation between Kantian thought and socialist thought and of the influence of Kant on the work of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. His 1925 biography of Kant became a classic of Kant scholarship for much of the 20th century. End footnote. Furländer did not entirely and back to text. Karl Furländer did not entirely deny Hegel's influence upon Marx, but reduced it to what Engels called Hegel's, quote, tremendous sense of the historical, end quote, which left a lasting impact upon Marxist thought. The tacit distinction between the works of the beginner, the young Marx infected by Hegelianism, and those of the mature thinker, the author of Capital, helped Furländer to disregard other evidence of Hegel's influence upon Marx. Footnote. The distinction between the young Marx, a Hegelian, and the older Marx, a thinker in his own right, was first made by Kautsky in reply to Lukács and Korsch's revisions of the accepted interpretation of the Marxian philosophy. See Eyring Fetcher, Das Verhältnis des Marxismus zu Hegel. End footnote. Furländer calculated that Marx quoted Hegel 11 times in the first volume of Capital and only once in the remaining 2 volumes. All these references could really be dispensed with, for they were merely meant to indicate either some analogies between Hegel's and Marx's views, or to testify to his respect for certain aspects of the Hegelian system, which replaced the derisive scorn for Hegel so conspicuous in some of Marx's earlier writings. They should be treated, to use Marx's own explanation, as a flirtation with Hegel's peculiar phraseology, as a homage to the, quote, mighty thinker, end quote, at that time reviled by his, quote, arrogant and mediocre, end quote, detractors, and thus as a testimony to Marx's utter contempt for them, his contempt being disguised as a respectful tribute paid to the old master by his former follower. Footnote. Karl Furländer, Karl Marx. As Marx's letter to L. Klugelmann of the 27th of June 1870 seems to show, apart from the young Hegelians among Hegel's depreciators, Marx also included F. A. Lange, Ludwig Buchner, Eugen Düring, and G. T. Fechner. End footnote. To regard Hegelianism in Marx as merely apparent, or to say that his thought shows no influence of Hegel's speculative philosophy, is a view which has repeatedly been challenged for a number of relevant and irrelevant reasons. Engels' opinion on this matter was accepted by German Marxist orthodoxy at the turn of the last century, and later also by Marxism-Leninism. In the course of time, it has become, quote, common knowledge, end quote, that Marx formulated rigorously and scientifically, as Plekhanov put it, quote, when Hegel is accidental, a guess of greater or lesser genius, end quote. Plekhanov. The acceptance of the Hegelianizing interpretation was due, above all, to the enormous prestige which Engels enjoyed in the socialist movement as the guardian of Marx's authentic thought. Another accidental reason was the fact that the first attempt to dissociate Marxian philosophy from its Hegelian ancestry, particularly from Hegelian dialectics, was made by Edward Bernstein. This implied, at least until Stalin's anti-Hegel pronouncement, that to free Marxian philosophy from its connection with Hegel was to indulge in revisionism. Quote, it is the greatest misfortune in the history of Marxian theory that Bernstein combined his drift toward reformism with an attack on the Hegelian Marxian philosophy. The philosophy was already dying a natural death among all sorts of Marxists, revolutionary and reformist alike, but Bernstein's overt attack upon it in the name of reformism automatically revived it in the minds of all genuine revolutionists, end quote. Max Eastman, Marx and Lenin. Bernstein felt that the Marxian doctrine could do without the, quote, treacherous, end quote, Hegelian dialectics which set snares upon Marx's thought and handicapped any consistent analysis of things. Whatever Marx and Engels accomplished, Bernstein wrote, they did not achieve by means of the dialectical method, but in spite of it. Footnote: Edward Bernstein, Die Voraussetzungen des Sozialismus und die Aufgaben der Sozialdemokratie. End footnote. Karl Kautsky and Plekhanov rejected Bernstein's conclusion. According to Plekhanov, the dialectical method was the most powerful instrument bequeathed by German idealism to its successor, modern materialism. Quote, "What remains of Marxism," end quote, asked Kautsky. Quote, "What remains of Marxism," end quote, asked Kautsky. Quote, "If it is deprived of dialectics, its, quote, best working tool," end quote, and its, quote, sharpest weapon," end quote. Was not Marx's and Engels' thinking dialectical through and through, end quote? Kautsky. Footnote: Kautsky, Bernstein und das Sozialdemokratische Programm. Bernstein's answer to Kautsky, first published in Die Neue Zeit, was reprinted in Zur Geschichte und Theorie des Sozialismus. End footnote. Although Kautsky only repeated certain well-established opinions above all those of Engels without examining their validity, his views prevailed in the dispute and were later endorsed by Max Adler and Heinrich Karl on the one hand and by Lenin on the other. Karl regarded dialectics as the most important procedure of Marx's method, without which Capital could not have been written. He was altogether convinced that, quote, "he who knows Hegel sees his influence in practically every sentence of Marx," end quote. Heinrich Karl. Die Marxische Geschichtsgesellschafts- und Staatstheorie. And Max Adler, Marxistische Probleme. End footnote. Similarly, Lenin felt that dialectics provides the essential point of convergence for the entire body of Marx's and Engels' ideas. To eliminate it from their system was to deprive them of the, quote, "thing that constituted the masterly advance they made in the history of revolutionary thought," end quote. Lenin, the Marx-Engels correspondence. These observations were directed against Bernstein. End footnote. As Lenin pointed out in The Three Sources and Three Component Parts of Marxism, the Marxian doctrine was the legitimate successor to the best that was created by mankind in the 19th century, of which one essential part was German classical philosophy, the other two English political economy and French socialism. In contradistinction to Kautsky, Lenin's verdict was based on some acquaintance with the philosophy of Hegel and was prompted by his tremendous admiration of it, repeatedly expressed in his philosophical notebooks. After Engels, it was Lenin who contributed most to establishing the view among Marx's followers that Marx shared some basic presuppositions and concepts with Hegel. This opinion is also supported by numerous philosophers and historians of philosophy, although they may differ as to which particular element of Hegel's philosophy they consider most important for an understanding of Marx. That Marx is indebted to Hegel for some of his ideas and categories is as plain as is his firm rejection of other Hegelian conceptions. To me, spaced out for a second. That Marx was indebted to Hegel for some of his ideas and categories is as plain as his firm rejection of other Hegelian conceptions. This simple fact provides the starting point for Sidney Hook's important study From Hegel to Marx. Hook was impressed by the fact that in Marxian philosophy we are faced by the, quote, persistence not merely of Hegelian terminology but of basic Hegelian categories, end quote. Consequently, Hook contended there are reasons to believe that the, quote, Hegelian elements in Marx are integral to his system, end quote. The fact that Hegel and Marx share some doctrines is as conspicuous as that they entirely disagree in others. It is important to emphasize both the similarities and dissimilarities in order to invalidate past and to forestall future attempts at Hegelizing the Marxian teaching in a one-sided way. Footnote, Sidney Hook, From Hegel to Marx, and footnote. Nobody can deny that in his youth Marx's mind was steeped in Hegel's doctrine, and that at that time he shared the illusions about the efficacy of critical philosophy, the war cry and the weapon of the Hegelian left, by means of which social consciousness was to be freed from its limitations and social reality reorganized on a rational basis. Marx was a Hegelian because he assumed that, quote, reason is the sovereign of the world, end quote, and that man is a thinking being. He was a young Hegelian of the left because he believed that thinking can bring reality into line with reason and reestablish their unity. As Marx put it in his own words at the time, quote, you cannot transcend philosophy without realizing philosophy, end quote. But Marx soon discovered that to realize philosophy, the weapon of criticism was not enough. A struggle that used as its weapon ideas alone was doomed to failure, for, quote, ideas cannot carry anything out at all, end quote. In order to make ideas effective, men who dispose of actual power are needed. As Marx wrote elsewhere, quote, material force can only be overthrown by material force, end quote. No theory becomes a material force unless it has seized the masses and moved them, quote, to overthrow all those conditions in which man is an abased, enslaved, abandoned, contemptible being, end quote. Critical philosophy was not such a theory. Instead of producing real changes, it merely indulged in phrase-making, combined the intellectual attitude of critical rationalism with an unqualified willingness to be reduced to intolerable social and political conditions. Marx began searching for an explanation of how it was possible that a deep involvement in ideas could be combined with a disdainful ignorance of the true state of reality. The source of this divergence, he maintained, should be sought in the nature of theory itself, and it's fair to find a material weapon to support its weapon of criticism. The basic defect of the young Hegelians was their belief that they could realize philosophy without transcending philosophy in actual life. More generally, they shared Hegel's failure to understand that no philosophy is realized in a people unless it fulfills the needs of the people. Having made this discovery, Marx passed on from the criticism of the illusory achievements of the young Hegelians to the critique of Hegel's philosophy. The defects of the young Hegelians only reflected the more fundamental defects of their master, Hegel. The critique comprised the Hegelian notion of the state whose sovereignty over civil society, rent by conflicts and strife and over the people, das Volk, given to action, quote, irrational, barbarous, frightful, end quote, was supposed to establish the rule of reason, the conception of history as a movement of logical categories which generate and turn into each other, the conception of man's self-creation through spiritual activity, and the conception of dialectics as the source of change and the modus operandi of the spirit. This critique of the Hegelian intellectual world made Marx a consistent opponent of Hegel and prompted some exponents to adopt the conclusion that the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 and the Holy Family marked Marx's final and complete emancipation from the influence of Hegelian philosophy. In fact, the disdainful hostility towards Hegel was an indication of Marx's abandonment of speculative philosophy and his transition into an empirically oriented, quote, science of man, end quote, into the study of history and political economy as domains of positive knowledge. In a letter to his father written in Berlin towards the end of 1837, Marx had referred to the grotesque, luring, and yet repelling melody, grotesca Felsen-Melodie, of Hegelian philosophy, which had made him feel ill at ease. He had fallen under the spell of this, quote, world philosophy, end quote, although he described this fact with a touch of self-irony. Footnote, Marx's letter to his father, 10th of November, 1837. And footnote, now the spell was broken. The new orientation of Marxist thought became increasingly apparent not only in the content but also in the language of his contributions posterior to the Holy Family, with the possible exception of The Poverty of Philosophy. for he abandoned the ambiguous idealist terminology and replaced it by a more precise and clear mode of expression. However, as Marx himself indicated in his preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, his criticism of Hegel was not exclusively destructive. It was in the course of his critique of Hegel's idealist cosmology, philosophy of history, and political and social theory that Marx arrived at the formulation of his own views on these matters, in which some of Hegel's conceptions were bound to survive, although they underwent a metamorphosis in the process of adaptation to the naturalistic worldview of Marx. They do bear the marks of their intellectual origin. Section 2. Marx's attitude towards Hegel. Before the impact of Hegel's speculative philosophy upon Marx is examined more closely, another problem has to be considered. In the foreword to Ludwig Feuerbach, Engels suggests that the evolution of Marx's and his own attitude to Hegelian philosophy was identical. Engels' statement has been tacitly accepted by practically every student of Marx. Merely by stating explicitly the implicit admission, one can see at once that it is untenable. As far as philosophical training and qualifications were concerned, Marx and Engels were not on a par. Hegel's influence on Marx was modified by Marx's wide philosophical knowledge and familiarity with the pre-Socratic philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, the Stoics, Bacon, Locke, Hobbes, Berkeley, Hume, Descartes, Spinoza, Condillac, the French materialists and philosophers of the French Enlightenment, Kant and Fichte. Footnote. For additional details, see Karl Vorländer, Kant und Marx. End footnote. When Marx wrote his doctoral dissertation, Hegel was for him an intellectual giant and the creator of a great new departments of knowledge. For instance, as Marx emphasized in his dissertation, prior to Hegel there was no history of philosophy worthy of note. But however high his regard for Hegel might have been, the young Marx viewed Hegel as standing on the shoulders, building on the foundations of his predecessors. He could excel their achievements not by the force of his own mind, but only because of the intellectual inheritance to which they had bequeathed to posterity. Hegel was for Marx a philosopher of genius, and yet his system did not veil the whole world from Marx's eyes. His admiration for Hegel was not the kind that makes the follower blind or uncritical to the master's intellectual defects. If Hegel was an intellectual giant for the young Marx, his repudiation went to pieces under the blows of Feuerbach's criticism, never to rise again to its previous Olympian heights. In his Kritik der Hegelischen Staatsphilosophie, Marx treated Hegel with bitter contempt. He referred to him as a, quote, sophist, end quote, who, quote, threw trivialities around, end quote, and indulges in arguments that are, quote, pure tautologies, end quote, confused thoughts, end quote, verworrene Gedanken, and, quote, wild conceptions, end quote, Vista Vorstellungen, of which Hegel accused others existed, in fact, in his own mind. In Hegel's mode of thinking, quote, the right approach is turned upside down. The simplest becomes the most intricate, and the most intricate becomes the simplest. What should provide the point of departure turns out to be a mystical conclusion, and what should be a rational conclusion is a mystical point of departure, end quote. Marx, Kritik der Hegelischen Staatsphilosophie. End footnote. When Marx left Germany to live in Paris and Brussels, a highly critical or even scornful attitude to Hegel became manifest in practically all his works. Footnote. The one possible exception was Zur Kritik der Hegelischen Rechtsphilosophie, Einleitung, 1844, where Marx spoke of the German philosophy of right and of the state, and in particular of Hegel's speculative philosophy of right, as the only German achievement that was abreast with modern times. He stated his position to this, quote, extravagant and abstract thought about the modern state, end quote, however abundantly and emphatically. End footnote. In Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, Marx gently proceeded to point out, quote, Hegel's one-sidedness and limitations, end quote. But in the Holy Family and the German ideology, his voice grew sharper, and in the poverty of philosophy, Hegel was treated as a laughingstock. Marx found in Hegel, quote, inconsistencies and, quote, drunken speculations, and he likened his dialectics of concepts to the, quote, war of gods known to the philosophers alone, end quote. Marx spoke with malice of, quote, the Hegelian miracle apparatus, end quote, by which metaphysical categories, quote, break out of logic, end quote, and assume familiar form of physical or human existence. Since Hegel reduced everything to a logical category, everything that happened was just what was going on in Hegel's own mind, and history became the history of his own philosophy. It was by a mere trick that Hegel proved the hegemony or spirit in history. He first drowned the whole of reality in a world of abstractions and fictions of the mind, and then proceeded to demonstrate that, quote, all that exists, all that lives on land and underwater, can be reduced to a logical category, end quote. The sacred history of the young Hegelians was just the, quote, old Hegelian junk, end quote, which in turn was, quote, nothing but the speculative expression of the Christian Germanic dogma of the opposition between God and the world, end quote. When Marx derided Proudhon for having misunderstood Hegel, he ridiculed him both for his ignorance of Hegel and for having believed that Hegel might provide the key to the real history. Even the object of Marx's former admiration, Hegel's philosophy of history, was derided because in it, as in philosophy of nature, which is the second part of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, quote, the son engenders the mother, the spirit nature, the Christian religion paganism, the result beginning, end quote. Summing up his basic attitude towards Hegel at that time, Marx observed that Hegel, quote, must transpose all questions from the form of human common sense to the form of speculative reason, and change the real question into a speculative one to be able to answer it, end quote. Hegel's answers remained obscure, for he replied to ordinary questions in the incomprehensible language of speculative philosophy. Nothing is explained if familiar, better known in intelligible terms, are replaced by unfamiliar, less known and unintelligible terms. In the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx's denunciation of the German world did not rise above a diatribe. However brilliant theoretically and rigorous intellectually it was. Although he observed marginally that there was a definite relationship between the abstractedness and presumptuousness of German philosophy on the one hand, and the degenerate state of German social and political reality on the other, he emphasized at the same time that the Germans were trying to achieve, at least in thought, what other nations had accomplished in fact. Footnote. In his evaluation of the German intellectual scene, Marx seems to have been indebted to Moses Hess's incisive analysis of Lorenz von Stein's book Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs, published under the title Sozialismus und Kommunismus in 21 Bogen aus der Schweiz, 1843. Hess's review is reprinted in his Philosophische und Sozialistische Schriften, 1837 to 1850. End footnote. In the German ideology, he felt that he could account for the appearance of Hegel's speculative philosophy and of the young Hegelians in sociological terms. Their doctrines were the illusions and distortions of ideologists, to be explained by their, quote, material surroundings and, quote, position in life. Philosophers do not grow like mushrooms straight from the soil. They are the fruit of their times and nation. Philosophical systems, evolved in the philosopher's brain, are constructed by the same spirit, Geist, which builds railroads with the hands of the workers. Footnote. Marx, Der Leitende Artikel, number 179, der Kölnischen Zeitung, 1842. Quote, philosophy too, end quote, wrote Hegel, quote, is its own time apprehended in thoughts. It is just as absurd to fancy that a philosophy can transcend its contemporary world as it is to fancy that an individual can overleap his own age, end quote. Hegel. The confused nationalism and preponderous rhetoric of the Germans reflected the fact of their being the most anachronistic of Western peoples. If the German situation of 1843 were suddenly done away with, Germany would still not have reached the pre-1789 era in terms of French chronology. There is a clear connection between German philosophy and German reality. Hegel and post-Hegelian developments are the price which Germany had to pay in the domain of the mind for her economic, social, and political backwardness. The speculative philosophy of Hegel left the real man entirely out of account, because for the German state the individual did not count at all. Although the, quote, dreamy and muddled German nation, end quote, took pleasure in watching its philosophers struggle with the shadows of reality, this spectacle, the exploitation of the absolute spirit, as Marx described it, testifies to the fact that, quote, across the Rhine, history stopped happening, end quote. The Marxian viewpoint was put even better, footnote. The Marxian viewpoint was put even better by F.A. Lange in his History of Materialism, the first edition of which appeared shortly before the publication of Capital. Towards the end of the 18th century, England and France withdrew from the theater of metaphysical war. But England produced the Industrial Revolution and France the revolution that shook Europe, and thus both countries were devoted entirely to the tasks of real life. Quote, meanwhile, end quote, Lange wrote, quote, metaphysics were left to us in Germany, end quote. Speculative fancies smothered the spirit of sound inquiry in the metaphysical Sturmendrang period, marked by the titanic efforts of Schelling and Hegel, stimulated the ambition of philosophers, quote, who like pharaohs piled one pyramid upon another in the sky and only forget to base them upon terra firma, end quote. History of Materialism, Volume 2, pages 235 to 8, end footnote. The outcome of this settling of accounts with Hegel was a complete break with his speculative philosophy. This did not preclude the assimilation and adaptation of some of Hegel's assumptions into Marx's own view of social and historical reality. A few Hegelian ideas, redefined and transformed, remain embedded in the thought of Marx, and this may account for the view of him as a lifelong Hegelian. It is fairly certain that in later years Marx did not look up Hegel, until one day in 1858, the German poet and revolutionary Ferdinand Freiligrath who lived from 1810 to 76, found some volumes of Hegel which originally belonged to Bakunin and sent them to Marx as a present. Footnote. Wikipedia says Ferdinand Freiligrath lived from 1810 to 1876 and was a German poet, translator, and liberal agitator who is considered part of the Young Germany movement. Back to the text. It is fairly certain that in later years Marx did not look up Hegel until one day in 1858, the German poet and revolutionary Ferdinand Freiligrath, who lived from 1810 to 1876, found some volumes of Hegel which originally belonged to Bakunin and sent them to Marx as a present. While informing Engels about this event, Marx made the often quoted statement that he, quote, would greatly like to make accessible to the ordinary human intelligence in 2 or 3 printer sheets what is rational in the method which Hegel discovered but at the same time enveloped in mysticism, end quote. Marx. In a letter to Engels, 14th of January, 1858. He never carried out this intention for lack of time, as is usually claimed, or for lack of interest, as is more probable. Freiligrath's present turned out to be a more important event in Engels' life than in Marx's. The work of Hegel left behind by Bakunin may account for the 11 references to Hegel in Capital, according to Forlander's account, but contrary to what Georg Lukács suggested, they did not revive Marx's interest in Hegelian philosophy. It is true that in later life Marx spoke of Hegel with a greater respect than he did in his youth, but he referred to him only when others raised the subject of his own alleged connections with or dependence on Hegel. These occasions were few. They concerned one single point, namely the dialectical method of Hegel and Marx, and dealt exclusively with the difference between Hegelian and Marxian dialectics. Thus, there were 3 distinct stages in Marx's relation to Hegel. First, in his youth, he was an ambiguous admirer of Hegel, only to become very shortly his disenchanted and disdainful philosophical opponent. At a mature age, Marx forgot both his admiration and hostility, and was able to discuss Hegel's merits and demerits dispassionately. For various reasons, he no longer paid any attention to the philosophy of Hegel. The philosophy that had once dominated Marx's mind receded more and more into the background and slowly fell into oblivion. The more sober mood in German philosophy in the second half of the 19th century encouraged this attitude of indifference toward Hegel. Indifference towards Hegel. Section 3. Engels' attitude towards Hegel. Unlike Marx, Engels never lost interest in Hegel. The longer he lived, the greater he admired Hegel, the greater an admirer of Hegel he became. And his intellectual history explains why he differed in this respect from Marx. Engels left the gymnasium at Elberfeld before he passed the Abitur, the second leaving school examination qualifying for admission to a university, and consequently he never received an academic education. Having left school prematurely, he decided, like his father, to make business his career. He thus outwardly complied with the standards accepted in his native Barmen, which he himself described in his Briefe aus dem Wuppertal. The merchants of Barmen, who could play whist and billiards, discuss politics, and pay compliments to ladies, enjoyed the reputation of being well-educated persons. The young men were brought up carefully by their elders, and they offered every hope of being perfect replicas of their fathers. This was not, however, the case with the old Engels' son, for whom Barmen, with its drowsy life, sanctimonious piety, and Philistine outlook, soon became, quote, too horrible, end quote, for words. Footnote: Engels' letters to Marx of 20th of January and 17th of March 1845. Engels followed in his father's footsteps, but during his business training in his father's firm in Barmen and later in Bremen, he also began to cherish the ambition of becoming a writer. He wrote poetry, came under the influence of young Germany, and tried his hand at literary journalism, in which he gained a fair reputation under the pen name Friedrich Oswald. D.F. Strauss's Life of Jesus, published in 1835, seemed to have influenced Engels considerably and awakened his philosophical interest. Although he continued to write poetry and to think of literary laurels for a few more years more, he soon disowned his previous artistic connections. He came to the conclusion that the writers of young Germany were precious aesthetes, ignorant of and unconcerned with the, quote, political movement, end quote, the striving for emancipation, end quote, originated by the, quote, great man, end quote, Hegel, and carried on by Strauss, Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, and the Deutsche Jahrbucher. Footnote: in his review of Alexander Jung's Vorlesungen über die moderne Literatur der Deutschen of 1842, Engels passed judgment not only on young Germany, but also on his own literary youth, and pointed out the direction in which he wished to go from then on. The Deutsche Jahrbücher, founded in 1838 and originally called the Hallische Jahrbücher, were published by Arnold Ruge as the organ of the young Hegelians. They were suppressed in 1843. End footnote. Engels was neither a born philosopher nor did he become one through education and hard thinking. Gustav Mahler, his biographer, Wikipedia says Gustav Mahler, who lived from 1871 to 1948, was a German journalist and historian who was with a particular focus on the labor movement. He fled Nazi Germany in 1933 and lived the final years of his life in England. Back to the text. Gustav Mahler, Engels' biographer, has emphasized that although Engels' inexhaustible appetite for work and his unusually versatile mind enabled him to read widely and to profit from his reading, his education was not systematic, and this accounts for his dilettante traits. He had neither the time nor the opportunity to study philosophy, but even if he had studied philosophy, he would not have excelled in the realm of abstract thought. His nature betrayed a constant craving for action, and he was at his best when he could exercise his practical capabilities. While his capacity for logical and philosophical analysis was not conspicuous, as Franz Mehring put it, he lacked, quote, in speculative depth, end quote. His talent for disseminating and popularizing ideas was outstanding. Engels' first knowledge of philosophy came from reading and discussing Hegel during his year-long stay in Berlin, where he went from Bremen for his military training in service in 1841. His early literary achievements secured him easy admission to a group of radical philosophical writers and literary pundits in the Prussian capital. The group, dominated by Bruno Bauer and Max Stirner, was known as the, quote, Freemen, end quote, Die Freien, a new name given to the former club of the young Hegelians. Engels joined the Freemen and followed their discussions among themselves and with their opponents. Footnote. The Freemen were by no means merely a debating society given exclusively to intellectual pursuits. They were also notorious for their buffooneries, ragging, and other exploits, épiter les bourgeois. Marx, who at that time contributed articles to the Rheinische Zeitung and soon became its chief editor, first declared their volatility and later broke with them entirely. He made no secret of the fact that in his opinion the Freemen lacked the seriousness of purpose and solid knowledge of the subjects with which they dealt in their journalistic activities, were fond of high-sounding phrases and indulged in self-adulation. The Freemen were not the best teachers of philosophy, and yet they were the only teachers Engels ever had. For the reputation of the Freemen, Marx's relation with them, and Engels' subsequent condescending attitude to Die Freien, see Franz Mehring, Karl Marx, pages 44 to 47, and Engels' letter to Marx of the 20th of January, 1845. End footnote. Thus it was the members of this group who introduced Engels to philosophy, that is, to Hegelian philosophy, and supplied Engels with his philosophical bearings for the rest of his life. For Engels' philosophy meant always, and above all, the philosophy of Hegel. Beyond this, quote, his philosophical equipment was light indeed, end quote. Footnote. Gustav Mahler, Friedrich Engels, Asaya Berlin, Karl Marx. Apart from Hegel, Engels read Schelling, and during his stay in the capital attended Schelling's lectures at Berlin University. His first philosophical publication, Schelling und Offenbarung, Schelling and Revelation, was concerned with the philosophy of Schelling, whom he criticized for his, quote, reactionary attack on free philosophy, end quote, that is, on the philosophy of Hegel, for Engels' German idealism was Hegelian philosophy. End footnote. Moreover, Engels' attitude to Hegel was strongly colored emotionally. Engels saw in German idealist philosophy, of which the Hegelian system was the culmination, the, quote, glory of Germany in the days of its deepest political humiliation, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. He also believed that Hegel inspired progressive tendencies in the German bourgeoisie, and particularly in the German educated classes, who, as soon as Hegel was put aside and forgotten, transferred their tempo from the philosopher's study to the stock exchange, came to be Philistine, took to money-making, and became self-complacent in their outlook. Footnote. When the Industrial Revolution started in Germany in earnest about the middle of the 19th century, Engels grudgingly recognized that as far as industry and commerce were concerned, the German bourgeoisie was at last doing its duty, but he had added that politically it exhibited a, quote, remarkable cowardice, end quote. End footnote. Engels also felt duty-bound to defend Hegelian philosophy against the, quote, vulgarizing peddlers and dabblers in materialism, end quote. That is, against Ludwig Buchner, Jakob Malerschat, and Karl Vogt, who ministered to the intellectual comfort of the bourgeoisie, converted to materialism, and derided the, quote, colossal chap, end quote, i.e. Hegel. It was in this patriotic spirit that Engels pronounced the German working-class movement to be the inheritor of German classical philosophy, a statement otherwise to be dismissed as empty rhetoric or philosophical vagary. Footnote. Other events in Engels' life seem also to indicate that his patriotism would occasionally become transformed into the prejudice of nationalism. See Gustav Meyer, Friedrich Engels. End footnote. In this respect, too, Engels' attitude to Hegel differed greatly from that of Marx to Hegel. Marx spoke with derision of the, quote, glow of national pride, end quote, in the breast of the Germans, awakened by their idealist philosophers, for the object of this pride merely reflected, in his opinion, the anachronism and parochialism of life in Germany. Engels himself confessed that he had a, quote, great feeling of piety and devotion, end quote, toward Hegel. This feeling was prompted, above all, by Engels' conviction that Hegel made a real and considerable contribution both to philosophy and natural science. Footnote. See Engels' letter to F.A. Lange on the 29th of March, 1865. Hegel's contributions to natural science were to be found, above all, in the second part of The Science of Logic. End footnote. Engels said in an article written in his youth, 1843, that never since men learned to think had there been a philosophical system as comprehensive as that of Hegel, and he did not change this view throughout his life. See Engels' Progress of Social Reform. That was a footnote, but end footnote. Engels sometimes attributed to Hegel ideas which by no stretch of imagination could be found in him. Footnote. See, for example, the preface to the first German edition of CWC. I don't know what CWC means. Condition. I guess that's probably condition of the working class in England. I'm not sure. Engels suggested that without Hegel, the first champ... No, that's probably not it. I'm not sure what 1844 is. CWC is. Anyway, see, for example, the preface to the first German edition of CWC, 1845, where Engels suggested that without Hegel, the first champions of German socialism and communism would not have discovered their views. Speaking of the champions of communism, Engels had Marx and himself in mind, although he might also have been referring to Moses Hess, whose essay, Über die sozialistische Bewegung in Deutschland, surely inspired some of Engels' opinions in the preface. In 1892, in the preface to the English edition of CWC, Engels returned to the same subject to make the puzzling observation that his book, quote, exhibits everywhere the traces of the descent of modern socialism from one of its ancestors, German philosophy, end quote, meaning the philosophy of Hegel. End footnote. Hegel's involved, ponderous, and pompous style persuaded Engels that Hegel's ideas contain an extraordinary depth and richness of insight incomparable with anything to be found in any other philosopher. Unlike Marx, who saw through Hegel's deceptions, Engels mistook Hegel's plain abuse of language, elementary errors of reasoning, and pretentious trivialities for originality, audacity, and profundity of thought. His philosophically untrained mind was impressed by Hegel's oracular pronouncements and deceived into believing that Hegel's intractable speculations were a paradigm of philosophical analysis and the product of an infallible philosophical method. Engels was utterly insensible to the poverty and shoddiness of Hegel's argument, to the verbosity and arrogance of his style, and to the obscurity and confusion of his language. All these considerations perhaps explain the fact that, quote, Engels swallowed more of Hegel than as a naturalist he could properly digest, end quote. Sidney Hook, From Hegel to Marx. It can almost be said that Engels' materialism is a naturalized Hegelianism. The work of Hegel offered by Friedrich to Marx, some of which, at least, Philosophy of Nature, passed into Engels' hands, marked a recrudescence of Engels' interest in the philosophy of Hegel and an increasing assertion of Hegel's influence over Engels' thinking. At the time when Engels started reading Hegel again, coincided with his study of natural science, the outcome of which was Anti-Düring and Dialectics of Nature. The consequences of his renewed interest in Hegelian philosophy were disastrous. In his review of Marx's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, written shortly after its publication, Engels noted that the revived interest in natural science, which was manifest in Germany after 1848, pushed the philosophy of Hegel aside and restored the, quote, Wolffian metaphysical method, end quote, to its former prominence. One second. Wikipedia says, this is in reference to Wolff, Christian Wolff, also known as Wolffius, ennobled as Christian Freiherr von Wolff in 1745, 24th of January 1679 to the 9th of April 1754, was a German philosopher. Wolff is characterized as one of the most eminent German philosophers between Leibniz and Kant. His life work spanned almost every scholarly subject of his time, displayed and unfolded according to his demonstrative, deductive, mathematical method, which some deemed the peak of Enlightenment rationality in Germany. Christian Wolff wrote in German as his primary language of scholarly instruction and research, though he did translate his works into Latin for his transnational European audience, a founding father of, among other fields, economics and public administration as academic disciplines. He concentrated especially in these fields, giving advice on practical measures to people in government and stressing the professional nature of university education. Back to the text. The distinction between the two modes of thought, the Hegelian and Wolffian, is exactly the same as that between metaphysics and dialectics, as elaborated in Anti-Düring. Engels made no secret of the fact that he considered ignorance of Hegelian philosophy and the restored prestige of the, quote, old metaphysics, end quote, as the development highly disadvantageous to the advance of knowledge. Although he concluded that, quote, the Hegelian method was absolutely unusable in its available form, end quote, he was still absolutely certain that it was the only method that could be used fruitfully at all. In Engels' view, the Hegelian method was essentially sound. It had numerous critics, but not one of its opponents had been able to, quote, make a breach in its proud structure, end quote. It fell into oblivion because the Hegelian school had not the slightest notion of what to do with it, and brought it into disrepute by reducing it to a ludicrous and clumsy manipulation of the simplest tricks. The dialectical method required a, quote, thoroughgoing criticism, end quote, to reveal its fruitfulness, but since this criticism was not an easy matter, all, quote, official philosophy, end quote, shirked from undertaking it. What others failed to do was accomplished by Marx. Quote, Marx was and is the only man who could undertake the work of extracting from the Hegelian logic the kernel which comprises Hegel's real discoveries in this sphere, and to construct the dialectical method, divested of the dialectical method's idealistic trappings, in the simple shape in which it becomes the only true form of development of thought. End quote. Engels. While in his review, Engels restricted the benefits to be derived from the Marxian revision of Hegelian dialectics to political economy, in his private notes and correspondence he went further and associated the unobstructed development of all all scientific knowledge with the application of the reconstructed dialectical method. The future was to belong to a combination of Hegelian philosophy and natural science. There is no doubt that Engels placed his full confidence in the inventive power of the dialectical method. Quote, "Where it is a question of concepts," end quote, he wrote, quote, "dialectical thinking will carry us at least as far as mathematical calculation," end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. In his periodical table of elements, Mendeleev achieved a scientific feat which is not too bold to put on par with Leverrier's calculation of the orbit of the planet Neptune. Wikipedia says Dmitry Mendeleev lived from 1834 to 1907 and was a Russian chemist and inventor. He is best known for formulating the periodic law and creating a version of the periodic table of elements. He has used the periodic law not only to correct the then accepted properties of some known elements, such as the valence and atomic weight of uranium, but also to predict the properties of three elements that were yet to be discovered: germanium, gallium, and scandium. Urbain Le Verrier, who lived from 1811 to 1877, was a French astronomer and mathematician who specialized in celestial mechanics and is best known for predicting the existence and position of Neptune using only mathematics. The calculations were made to explain discrepancies with Uranus's orbit and the laws of Kepler and Newton. Le Verrier sent the coordinates to Johann Gottfried Galle in Berlin, asking him to verify. Galle found Neptune the same night he perceived Le Verrier's letter, within 1 degree of the predicted position. The discovery of Neptune is widely regarded as a dramatic validation of celestial mechanics and is one of the most remarkable moments of 19th century science. And back to the text. But Mendeleev made his discovery, quote, by means of the unconscious application of Hegel's law of the transformation of quantity into quality, end quote. Engels. Similarly, Darwin's theory of evolution provides, quote, the practical proof of Hegel's account of the interconnection between necessity and chance, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Engels failed to observe that Mendeleev's classification of elements was based on a large collection of empirically established regularities concerning the properties of chemical substance. Nor did Engels touch the crucial point of the matter, namely, the question as to whether these alleged confirmations are actually deducible from the laws of dialectics. For instance, whether the periodic table could be logically deduced from Hegel's law or not. If it cannot be thus deduced, it is incorrect and futile to say that Mendeleev arrived at his discovery by the conscious or unconscious application of the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. Hegel, Engels argued, was accused of having twisted words because he was thinking dialectically. Quote, but if nature itself proceeded exactly like old Hegel, it is surely time to examine the matter more closely, end quote. The fact is, Engels continued, that Hegel was capable of giving the most striking illustrations of the dialectical laws from nature and history, and of anticipating, by means of these laws, later scientific discoveries. In his correspondence with Marx, Engels was inclined to credit the, quote, old man, end quote, that is, Hegel, with having, quote, scented, end quote, with the assistance of the dialectical method, many contemporary discoveries in physics, chemistry, or biology. The cell, quote, is Hegel's, quote, being in itself, end quote. and its development undergoes exactly the Hegelian process, resulting in the, quote, idea, i.e. the particular completed organism, end quote. Engels, letter to Marx, 14th of July, 1858. The molecule, quote, as the smallest part of matter capable of independent existence, is a perfectly rational category, a, quote, node, end quote, as Hegel put it, in the infinite series of divisions, which does not conclude them but establishes a qualitative difference, end quote. Engels, letter to Marx, 16th of June, 1867. Comparative physiology provides very fine instances of, quote, the Hegelian qualitative leap in the quantitative series, end quote. Footnote, Engels' letter to Marx, 14th of July, 1858. Whatever doubts Engels might have felt as to the predictive power of Hegelian philosophy, allegedly revealed by these, quote, instances, he was certain that, quote, if Hegel had a philosophy of nature to write today, the facts would come flying to him from every side, end quote. Engels' letter to Marx, 14th of July, 1858. As he wrote elsewhere, end footnote, as he wrote elsewhere, philosophy was taking its revenge posthumously on natural science for its desertion. Engels made no secret of the fact that he regarded English empirical philosophy as greatly inferior to German idealist philosophy. English empiricism was a symptom of philosophical backwardness or an infantile disorder which English thinkers would eventually overcome with maturity, then to rise themselves to the heights of German idealism. Footnote, Engels, Die Lage Englands, Past and Present, by Thomas Carlyle, London, 1843. It is amusing to observe that in the short run Engels' prophecy came true. In the second half of the 19th century, quote, Hegelianism modified by Anglo-Saxon caution, end quote, this is H.J. Patton's expression, did become the predominant philosophical school in England, and in the person of F.H. Bradley delivered a sharp attack upon the empiricist school. End footnote. Herbert Marcuse's observation that German idealism rescued philosophy from the destructive onslaught of British empiricism faithfully reflects Engels' thinking on the matter. British empiricism involved the abdication of reason, the abandonment of the unity and universality of knowledge which cannot be found in or based upon empirical reality. British empiricism surrendered the intellectual and material existence of men to the blind and fortuitous pressure of events and prevented them from ever becoming the masters of their historical fate. As Moses Hess put it, the cult of soulless fact deprives us of the ability to act freely and spontaneously. Engels vied with Hegel in making plain his scornful attitude towards empirical knowledge, and his Dialectics of Nature swarms with abuse for, quote, mere experience, end quote, or, quote, shallow empiricism, end quote, and with contemptuous obiter dicta about the, quote, whole swindle of induction, end quote. Engels became more and more convinced that natural science needed, above all, Hegelian philosophy and its dialectical method to make ever more discoveries of all kinds. As he saw it, German idealism was a necessary and constitutive element of all knowledge, which gave a true view of the world and helped man to gain increasing mastery over nature and society. Hand in hand with Engels' increasing confidence in the inventive power of the dialectical method went his increasing respect for Hegel himself. Engels' view on Hegel's importance for natural science resulted from his deep conviction that even in the scientist's own special sphere, philosophers can acquire knowledge superior to scientific knowledge. For this reason, he put Leibniz above Newton, Kant above Laplace, and Hegel above all the natural scientists of his time. Wikipedia says, Pierre Simon Laplace. who lived from 1749 to 1827, was a French scholar whose work was important to the development of engineering, mathematics, statistics, physics, astronomy, and philosophy. He summarized and extended the work of his predecessors in his 5-volume Mécanique Céleste, Celestial Mechanics, 1799 to 1825. This work translated the geometric study of classical mechanics to one based on calculus, opening up a broader range of problems. In statistics, the Bayesian interpretation of probability was developed mainly by Laplace. Laplace formulated Laplace's equation and pioneered the Laplace transform form, which appears in many branches of mathematical physics, a field that he took a leading role in forming. The Laplacian differential operator, widely used in mathematics, is also named after him. Laplace restated and developed the nebular hypothesis of the origin of the solar system and was one of the first scientists to suggest an idea similar to that of a black hole, with Stephen Hawking stating that, quote, Laplace essentially predicted the existence of black holes, end quote. Laplace is regarded as one of the greatest scientists of all time, sometimes referred to as the French Newton or Newton of France. He has been described as possessing a phenomenal natural mathematical faculty, superior to that of almost all his contemporaries. He was Napoleon's examiner when Napoleon graduated from École Militaire in Paris in 1785. Laplace became a Count of the Empire in 1806 and was named a Marquis in 1817 after the Bourbon Restoration. 1 second. Get a drink here. There's no water. Never mind, no drink. Engels admired Hegel's profundity of thought, which is unaffected by the, quote, absurdities of detail, end quote, and which is allegedly combined with a thorough knowledge of mathematics and natural science. Footnote: Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Engels' letter to F.A. Lange, 29th of March, 1865. Engels rejected firmly, almost contemptuously, Lange's suggestion that Hegel lacked knowledge of science and mathematics. Back to the text. End footnote. Hegel was a man of the greatest genius whose achievements as a dialectician could not be surpassed. It was Hegel who formulated for the first time the general laws of development of nature, society, and thought, which, quote, will always remain an act of historical importance, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Engels was firmly convinced that once Hegel's idealist point of departure and his arbitrary construction of the system were discarded, Hegel was nearly infallible. Not Hegel himself, but his followers, above all the young Hegelians and, quote, true socialists, end quote, were responsible for Hegelianism acquiring the reputation of being, quote, abstract and abstruse, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels was always ready to defend Hegel tooth and nail, and he was confident that soon everybody would speak of Hegel with the reverence which he so amply deserved. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. For Engels, only Karl Marx rose above the heights reached by Hegel. Otherwise, Hegel was head and shoulders above everybody else, including Newton, quote, the inductive ass, end quote, who managed to establish himself as the founder of modern mechanics, although this title should have been bestowed upon Kepler. Hegel was the man most often referred to and quoted admiringly in both Anti-Düring and Dialectics of Nature, and in this respect, no one else, neither Newton nor Darwin, came even close to Hegel. Engels presented Hegel as a thinker who foresaw the path which the advancement of knowledge would take. His works were full of, quote, prophetic passages, end quote, which were confirmed by the development of science. Engels never renounced his conviction that inexhaustible riches of ingenuity, perceptiveness, and truth were concealed in Hegel's philosophy, since they were hidden, quote, beneath the false form and within the artificial connections, end quote. The, quote, truth and genius, end quote, in Hegelian philosophy had to be discovered. This is one of the great contributions of Marx and his own as well. Engels' defense does not essentially differ from the argument of contemporary admirers of Hegel who claim that, quote, what Hegel says abstractly and obscurely can be put concretely and lucidly, end quote. Consequently, to bring to light Hegel's merits and greatness, no more is necessary than to translate what he said into plain English. Footnote: Engels' letter to Conrad Schmidt, 1st of November 1891, J. Plemenatz, Man and Society, see J. Plemenatz, Man and Society, Volume 2. Marx expressed sharply his opinion on the attempts to salvage the Hegelian philosophy by a suitable, quote, translation or interpretive analysis. The translation thus accomplished leaves, however, considerable doubt as to whether it reveals Hegel as a philosopher and a social theorist of genius or simply testifies to the inventive ability of the translator. Engels' conviction that the Hegelian philosophy was, as he put it, quote, only another expression, end quote, of what modern science continued to discover at every step of its advancement, greatly influenced the way he presented the Marxian doctrine in his own philosophical contributions, above all, dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism acquired numerous idealistic features and became permeated with speculative and irrationalistic elements. In its context, terminology, and even particular formulations, it showed the birthmarks of its origin, that is, of the philosophy of Hegel, from which its main themes were derived. For Engels, this was a legitimate procedure in view of the fact that, quote, the Hegelian system represents merely a materialism idealistically turned upside down in methods and content, end quote. This view, endowed with the authority of Engels, had and continues to have fateful consequences for the development of Marxian naturalism. Section 4. Marx's indebtedness to Hegel. Hegel's influence upon Engels' philosophical views is very apparent, as Engels often simply rehearsed or reproduced textually the opinions of the quote, great dialectician, end quote. The impact of Hegel's philosophy upon Marx was less conspicuous. It can be detected only in certain general attitudes and orientations which Marx shared with or adopted from Hegel. This applies, for instance, to the basic Hegelian idea of universal movement and the interconnection between all things. Lenin regarded both the Marxian materialist conception of history and the Darwinian theory of evolution as a, quote, application to life and society, end quote, of Hegel's, quote, dialectic of negativity, end quote. Hegel's development of the concept out of itself, in the course of which the concept engenders its determinants and establishes its connection with other concepts, became self-movement, self-generating change, and the spontaneous activity of materialist philosophy. There's no reason to suppose that Darwin was inspired by Hegel, but there is much agreement about Lenin's claim that Marx was influenced by Hegel's views of history. For instance, it is often said that Marx made use of the, quote, dialectical negativity as the moving and generating principle, end quote, and that he transformed it into his conception of the, quote, self-genesis of man, end quote, that is, of social evolution. Footnote. Marx did believe that spontaneous generation is the only alternative to creation, but did not derive the concept of generatio equivoca from the Hegelian philosophy, as Lenin seemed to believe. Marx found it as a universally known conjecture, discussed by Aristotle and revived by the biologist in the 17th and 18th centuries. See C. Singer, A Short History of Scientific Ideas. Marx combined it with the first evolutionary ideas, particularly in geology. He called it geogeny, and considered it in this modernized form as a, quote, mighty blow, end quote, to the view of the creation of the world. End footnote. Marx himself admitted that he conceived history as, quote, the process of development of man himself, end quote, under Hegel's influence. To comprehend, quote, objective man, true because real man is the outcome of man's own labor, end quote, is the outstanding and final conclusion of Hegel's phenomenology of mind. Moreover, it is widely believed that not only the conception of the self-genesis of man, but also, if not more so, the whole theoretical framework of the Marxian view of history is Hegelian. Engels and Plekhanov emphasized this aspect of Marx's dependence upon Hegel very strongly. Hegel, wrote Engels, was the first who, quote, attempted to show a development and inner coherence in history, end quote. On this account, Marx, notwithstanding his complete repudiation of Hegelian philosophy, allegedly greatly admired Hegel for the, quote, grandeur of his fundamental outlook, end quote. It was Hegel's, quote, epoch-making conception of history, end quote, which, quote, was the direct theoretical premise for the new materialist outlook, end quote. Engels. According to Plekhanov, Marx owed to Hegel the conception of the history of humanity as a process regulated by law. Quote, like Hegel, Marx saw human history as a process conforming to laws and independent of man's arbitrariness. Like Hegel, Marx considered all phenomena in the process of their appearance and their disappearance. Like Hegel, Marx was not satisfied with barren metaphysical explanations of historical phenomena. And lastly, like Hegel, Marx endeavored to trace to a universal and single source all the acting and interacting forces of social life, end quote. Plekhanov. To say that Hegel was the first to see development, coherence, and a process conforming to law in history is not entirely correct. Hegel is preceded by an array of French writers of the Enlightenment, above all by Voltaire, Turgot, Condorcet, by Giambattista Vico, who lived from 1668 to 1744, Adam Ferguson, who lived from 1723 to 1816, Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755, and Kant, 1724 to 1804, all of whom were known to Marx. Footnote. As a matter of fact, Marx quoted Ferguson's essay on the history of civil society, written in 1767, in The Poverty of Philosophy and Capital, Montesquieu's Esprit de Loi in 1748, and Vico's Scienza Nuova in 1725 in Capital. A German translation of Scienza Nuova had been available since 1822. Comte spoke of historical development as a universally known idea. Quote, nobody can deny the reality of the movement, bracket, in history, end bracket, which is deeply felt even by those who curse it, end quote. Comte's preliminary outline of an organic view of history, Système de politique positive, which was first published in Saint-Simon's Catéchisme des Industriels, and was known to Marx, appeared in 1822. Hegel was not the first to discover development and coherence in history, but the first to make systematic use of them, to adopt, quote, the true historical view, the genuinely philosophical position, end quote, of, quote, always treating the part in its relation to the whole, end quote. Footnote. Hegel. In the quoted passages, Hegel recognized that he owed his, quote, true historical view, end quote, to Montesquieu. End footnote. This is one of the important reasons why in some philosophical circles in Germany and elsewhere the view has been held that Hegel had contributed greatly to the discovery of the concept of evolution, and that his idea of evolution not only preceded but was also superior to that of Darwin. Footnote. C. H. Rickert, Kulturwissenschaft und Naturwissenschaft. A similar point of view was adopted by R.G. Collingwood in The Idea of Nature, and by Polish Marxist-Leninist Adam Schaff. I have a piece by Adam Schaff on this channel. He was in Erich Fromm's Socialist Humanist Compendium. End footnote. Engels' assertion that Hegel's conception of history provides the theoretical premise of the materialist outlook is either false or misleading. Hegel regarded history as the unfolding of a single metaphysical substance of which human individuals were but the bearers, and insisted that its transformations were not a temporal but a logical process making manifest the potentialities contained in the notion. He thus denied the idea of evolutionary change, of the development of the higher from the lower in time. To say that concepts develop is to speak either metaphorically or nonsensically. Clearly, concepts do not develop into anything else or into each other. For Marx, history had no metaphysical substance. It was not, quote, a person apart, using man as a means for its own particular aims, end quote. History was the action of men who, being divided into economically determined groups and classes, represented conflicting social interests and hence were the compelling force of change. While development in the Hegelian sense was the transformation of one concept into another, Marx was able to describe it in genuinely genetic or evolutionary terms and could show how each state of society grew out of the preceding state of society and was parent to the subsequent state. Hegel presented us with a series of dramatic situations ostensibly logically related to each other. Marx described a process of social transformation. See J. Plekhanov's Man and Society. The theories of Hegel and Marx differ entirely in their universe of discourse and the relations obtaining among the individuals which make up their respective universe. Hegel and Marx also differ widely in their procedure of discovering regularities and of testing their hypotheses. While Hegel made oracular pronouncements, Marx applied what Hegel contemptuously called, quote, the abstract, non-philosophical method of the sciences, end quote. That is, Marx tried to base his various theories on experience and provide them with empirical significance. As Plekhanov emphasized, the similarity of particular ideas and general orientations underlying the Hegelian and the Marxian conception of history is undeniable. But the latter cannot be derived from the former. Their respective theoretical frameworks are entirely dissimilar. They are constructed on the basis of mutually exclusive assumptions and by means of utterly different rules of procedure. The similitude of attitudes combined with antithetical basic assumptions and contrasting procedures can also be found in the Marxian principle of ontological holism, which Marx might have adopted from Hegel. Footnote. See Sidney Hook, From Hegel to Marx. End footnote. For Hegel, ontological holism was a consequence of the metaphysical fact that the real is the universal. But his holism emphasized above all the superior worth of wholeness or totality of such entities as the state, nation, or society, which being the perfect embodiment of spirit have a self-contained and self-sufficient existence. When contrasted with the interest of the totality, the interest of the individual are subordinate, for it is the individual who exists for the sake of the whole, and not the whole for the sake of the individual. Hegel was not concerned with living and struggling men unless they incarnated abstract categories and the aspirations of spirit. As Hegel stated over and over again in the philosophy of right, quote, the individual counts only as one amongst many, end quote, and the individual's worth lies in, quote, aligning himself with the universal, end quote. Hegel. The ontological holism of Marx had no normative basis. The ontological holism of Marx reflected an empirical state of affairs and did not express a value judgment. For Marx, as for Feuerbach, men precede man and the human individual. Quote, Peter only establishes his own identity as a man by first comparing himself with Paul as being of the same kind, end quote. And, quote, man first sees and recognizes himself in other men, end quote. Marx, capital. The principle of ontological holism in the Marxian sense was concerned with the fact that society and groups are prior to the individuals who compose those groups. And the principle of ontological holism in the Marxian sense stated in an abstract way what sociological determinism expressed in empirical terms. Individuals, Marx explained, have their conditions of existence, their position in life, and their personal development predestined by their class. Footnote. For the conceptual sociological determinism in Marx, see Jordan, PHI. I don't know what that is. It's an abbreviation for a book by Z.A. Jordan, but I'm not sure what book, because I'm not going to try to find the abbreviation, what that abbreviates. From the principle of ontological holism, Marx deduced the methodological rule that man should never be dissociated from his environment nor be considered apart from man's social setting, and that the behavior of individuals should be explained by the laws of the social system as a whole. Individuals acting and reacting upon another give rise to a new reality whose characteristics are impersonal, in the sense that those characteristics are not determined by the particular characteristics of individuals. Since social facts of which this new reality consists result from the association and interaction of individuals, these social facts cannot be reduced to the psychological laws which determine the activity of particular individuals. That these ideas, constituting a component part of the materialist conception of history, might have been conceived under the influence of Hegelian philosophy cannot be denied, but this genetic relationship does not depreciate the originality of the Marxian view. To say that there is a conformity to law in history is one thing. To say that this law in history explicitly, to state this law explicitly and to explain how it operates is quite another. Apart from sharing the belief in the lawfulness of the historical process, Hegel and Marx went their own entirely different ways. The materialist conception of history remains an independent, creative effort to discover the regularities of the historical process, and as Engels put it, provides a solution to the problem that Hegel propounded but did not solve. The Marxian anthropological realism and theory of knowledge, which were influenced by Hegel in the sense that Hegel persuaded Marx of the necessity to dissociate naturalism and materialism from the causal and representationist theory of perception, help us to understand the function of the dialectical method in Marx's way of conceiving the world. There is a consensus communis, including Marx himself, that he derived his dialectic from Hegel's, that before Marx adopted the Hegelian method, Marx changed the Hegelian method considerably, or to use Marx's own words, Marx transformed Hegel's method into Hegel's method's, quote, direct opposite, end quote, and that the Marxian dialectics no longer applies to the self-developing thought or spirit, but to the, quote, material world, end quote, thus becoming the, quote, method of dealing with matter, end quote. See Marx, Capital, Volume 1. But in spite of this wide measure of agreement, the crucial point about the dialectical method of Marx, namely how the dialectical method of Marx should be understood, remains unexplained. Marx and Engels repeatedly spoke of the mystifying side of Hegelian dialectics, by which they did not necessarily mean its idealistic presuppositions, but simply the fact that one really does not know to what it applies, which element it relates, and consequently how it operates. The same objection could easily be raised against the Marxian dialectical method. Like Hegelian dialectics, the dialectical method of Marx includes both some specific metaphysical presuppositions and some rules of procedure. Marx referred to these presuppositions as, quote, a scandal and abomination to the bourgeoisie and doctrinaire professors, end quote, because it, quote, includes in its comprehension and affirmation, it includes in its comprehension and affirmative recognition of the existing state of things, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary, end quote. Engels, writing some 30 years later about the, quote, great fundamental thought, end quote, underlying the dialectical method, felt, unlike Marx, that the dialectical method had become so widely accepted as to be virtually uncontradicted. The basic assumption of the dialectical method was that, quote, the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes, in which the things apparently stable, no less than their mind images, Gedankenabbilder, in our heads, the concepts, die Begriffe, go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away, in which, in spite of all seeming accidentality and of all temporary retrogressions, a progressive development asserts itself in the end. End quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels' formulation includes the Hegelian conception of the cunning of reason, also apparent in other parts of Ludwig Feuerbach, the book, which is not an integral part of, and is absent from Marx's presuppositions of the dialectical method as distinct from those of Engels. For Hegel's definition of the cunning of reason, see EPHS, I'm not sure what that one is, section 209. End footnote. Oh, come on, man. My computer froze. No. Wait, it's back. The assumption concerning the constant action, change, transformation, and development of the whole world and everything in it is so strongly emphasized and so little differentiated from Marxian dialectics that it could and did lead to the identification of dialectics with dialectics presupposition. Quote, the dialectic, end quote, wrote Benedetto Croce, quote, is the rhythm of the development of things, i.e. the inner law of things in things development, end quote. Benedetto Croce. Historical Materialism and the Historical Materialism and the Economics of Karl Marx. The assumption concerning the constant Max Adler saw in dialectics a, quote, magnificent mode of thought, end quote, based on the idea that the world constantly develops and obeys a force immanent and inherent in itself. Max Adler, Marx als Denker. A similar point is made by Karl Vorländer, for whom the all-pervasive and relentless process of evolution provides the core of dialectics. According to M.M. Bober, dialectics is the, quote, the pervasive power instinct in all phenomena, end quote, which controls their flow from one state to another and their development. Quote, the dialectics is the law of evolution discernible in all domains, in nature, society, and human thought, end quote. M.M. Bober, Karl Marx's interpretation of history. According to Sidney Hook, Marx, even more than Hegel recognized the primary character of change and development on every plane of existence. Everything which is given, be it a system of morals or a style of art or the price of a commodity, has been produced and is bound to disappear at some time. Quote, that is what in the first instance the dialectical method of Hegel meant for Marx, end quote. Sidney Hook, From Hegel to Marx. But the basic assumption of Hegelian dialectics involved not only universal changeability, but also some definite stages through which every change had to pass. Moreover, change carried within itself the dynamic principle which accounts for that change's occurrence and which was perpetuated by the constant tension between conflicting, struggling, and incompatible forces. Without some rhythmic articulation of the flow of self-generating change, there could be no dialectics and no dialectical method. The inventive and predictive power of the method was supposed to reflect the fact that the method rules reproduced, as it were, what in nature and history asserted itself unconsciously. These rules were the correlates, or, quote, moments, end quote, in Hegelian language of the patterns of change embodied in the dialectical process. For that reason, Marx could have said of Hegel that he conceived all philosophy as method, and the Hegelianizing exponents of Marx's philosophy could have inferred the plainly absurd conclusion that since motion can be understood only in terms of moving thought, a special method, that is, the dialectical method, was necessary to understand change in nature and society. Footnotes. Plekhanov used the above-stated conclusion to justify the claim of the superiority of dialectics over formal logic. See also Bukharin's Historical Materialism. For the same reason, though turned the other way around, Engels and later Lenin associated the dialectical method with the science of the, quote, general laws of motion, both of the external world and of human thought, end quote. Without being based on external or objective dialectics, the dialectical method could not be regarded as a reflection of the most general regularities of nature and would lose the dialectical method's claim to universal validity. Marx was not concerned with all these problems which attracted so much attention on the part of Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin. Marx conceived nature in historical and social terms, and the assumption of the, quote, identity of thought and being, end quote, could only have a sociological but never a metaphysical meaning for Marx. The anthropological realism of Marx precluded the adherence to absolute materialism of any sort, including dialectical materialism. As no dialectical materialism can be found in Marx, there is no room in Marx's philosophy for any dialectics of nature, nor for dialectics as a method of natural science. I'm going to repeat that. As no dialectical materialism can be found in Marx, there is no room in Marx's philosophy for any dialectics of nature, nor for dialectics as a method of natural science. One has to agree with Werner Sombart that it is a monstrous idea to apply Hegelian dialectics to the world of experience. From an empirical point of view, Hegelian dialectics is utter nonsense. Footnote. Werner Sombart, Der proletarische Sozialismus. In Capital, the book, Marx refers to the, quote, law discovered by Hegel that merely quantitative differences beyond a certain point pass into qualitative changes, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. Marx did not make use of this observation because the way an economist might describe the fact that not every sum of money can be transformed into capital, or the way a chemist might describe his findings, is irrelevant to a naturalistic analysis of social activity, which would have to deal with his findings a naturalistic analysis of social activity which would have to deal with non-quantifiable concepts. End footnote. For Marx, the dialectical method is not a universal procedure applicable to any subject matter. Dialectics is a purely historical and social concept and applies exclusively to social phenomena and historical events. That the dialectical method is a historical method was rightly stressed and convincingly stated by Georg Lukács in his celebrated work, History and Class Consciousness, by Sidney Hook, and more recently also by many others. The dialectics of nature, irrespective of whether it is a constitutive principle in nature or not, provides no basis for the class struggle and social revolutions. The dialectics of nature is not even suited to supply the analytical means for the investigation of social action and social change. It is the concept of reciprocal action or interaction that is central to Marxian dialectics. Marx's thought seems to be dominated by the idea that the interaction, conflict between a particular kind of interaction, between parts or elements of a given social or historical system, is the ultimate source of its change, development, or progress. This computer is being a stinky penis today. Footnote. If I can get to the footnote, Christ on the cross. According to R.C. Tucker, Hegel means by dialectics, quote, the pattern or mechanism of development through inner conflict, end quote. See Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx. But while for Hegel conflict arises from the division of the spirit against the spirit self, for Marx conflict means what it ordinarily means, that is, quote, antagonism, quote, fight, and, quote, struggle, examples of which are the conflict of class interests or of group interests within the same class. End footnote. Marx held this view explicitly and stated in The Poverty of Philosophy explicitly. Civilization is based on conflict. Quote, no antagonism, no progress. This is the law that civilization has followed up to our days. End quote. The most important aspect of social change, whose propulsive force is provided by interaction, antagonism, conflict, and strife, is the change in the relative position of major social groups, that is, of social and economic classes. It is often said that Marx's views of society as the scene of constant conflict and unavoidable strife is a transposition of Hegel's conception of development as the unfolding of the contradiction inherent in all things. In Hegel's philosophy, this assumption is closely connected with the belief that everything carries within itself the conditions of its own disappearance. This pattern of change lies, according to Hegel, at the root of every natural process, provides its dynamic, and, quote, forces nature out of itself, end quote. The rhythm of the pendulum is even more apparent in the spiritual world, where it tends, by force of imminent necessity, to bring about the transition of one state of affairs into its direct opposite. To Engels' delight, before Hegel was born, Rousseau had played with this idea in his description of the transformation of free, equal, and happy societies of the past into societies riddled and disrupted by the distinction of class, wealth, and power. This approach, characterized by bold flights of imagination and supported by merely a handful of illustrations, has been attributed to Marx and has allegedly put him yet deeper in Hegel's debt. Footnote. The attribution was first made by Engels, who wrote in 1843 that communism was an inescapable result of the neo-Hegelian philosophy, and consequently that no opposition could stop this development of ideas, quote, progress of social reform on the continent, end quote. Engels repeated the same claim in 1845 and emphasized that the German champions of communism arrived at it, quote, by way of the Feuerbachian dissolution of Hegelian speculation, end quote. Preface to the first German edition. I don't know. He keeps using abbreviations, and I can't remember what the abbreviations are for. As has been pointed out earlier, Engels probably only reproduces the view first voiced by Moses Hess, with whom he shared philosophical naivete and an uncritical admiration for German idealism. That Marx derived his, quote, socialist theory, end quote, from the Hegelian negation of the negation was one of the main points in Eugen Dühring's criticism of Marx. End footnote. According to Marx's celebrated prophecy, the capitalist mode of production created by its own development the conditions from which it must perish. Expropriation of labor during primitive accumulation leads to the expropriation of the expropriators and the reestablishment of individual property on the basis of social ownership of land and of the industrial means of production. The Marxian way of viewing social and historical reality seems to presuppose the acceptance of the Hegelian conception concerning negativity as the manifest trait and logical contradiction as the universal form of reality. There is not the slightest doubt that Engels embraced this Hegelian concept, but there is no evidence apart from Engels' endorsement of Hegel's doctrine on contradiction that Marx ever did. Again, the anti-metaphysical, anthropological conception of nature makes it extremely unlikely that after his youthful period of Hegelizing, Marx took Hegel's dialectic of negativity seriously. Marx himself pointed out that in his view about the economic basis of class structure and class conflict as an essential characteristic of capitalist society, he was influenced by, quote, bourgeois historians and, quote, bourgeois economists, end quote. Among the bourgeois historians who were first to discover the existence of classes in modern society and to describe the struggle between them, Marx mentioned Guizot and Thierry, quote, the father of the, quote, class struggle, end quote, in French historiography, end quote. The bourgeois historians are supported in their views by, quote, the masterminds among the economists of Europe, end quote, by Malthus, Ricardo, Millsay, Torrens, Wakefield, McCulloch Sr., Whately, R. Jones, and others. The economists showed that, quote, the economic basis of the different classes are bound to give rise to a necessary and ever-growing antagonism among them, end quote. Marx concluded that no credit was due to him and by implication to Hegel for the discovery of the existence of classes and their struggle in modern society. See Marx's letter to J. Weidemeyer of the 5th of March, 1852. Marx's letter to Engels, 27th of July, 1854. Contrary to the Hegelizing interpretation, Marx's social theory based on strife and conflict owed at least as much to historiography and economics as to the speculative philosophy of Hegel. Moreover, the reality of class antagonism and its role in history were clearly recognized by many utopian socialists, as Marx himself admitted in the Communist Manifesto. If Marx's indebtedness to Hegel is to be accepted, Herbert Marcuse's interpretation seems to be more probable and convincing. According to Marcuse, Hegel's negativity of reality became a historical condition in Marx, a time-bound form of society which should no longer be hypostatized into a metaphysical state of affairs. Each socioeconomic formation produces in men the awareness of its defects and of the appropriate remedies to correct these defects. In the Marxian conception, social change resulting from interaction arises spontaneously and, as it were, inevitably in view of the fact that society is the, quote, product of men's reciprocal approach, end quote. Thus, for Marx, the necessary conditions of social change are also the necessary conditions of the very existence of society. Moreover, there is the dialectical nexus, that is, the reciprocal action between the natural and material conditions of production on the one hand and social organization on the other. Human evolution is the combined result of the determination of man by man's natural conditions and of the alteration of nature by human activity. Man changes and develops his nature by reacting upon his environment, by which he is determined. More specifically, men live and operate within a natural and social framework which is no creation of their own will. They are by no means free to choose the form of society for themselves, for this form exists before they do, and is the product of former generations. Consequently, men experience these conditions as an alien and objective force, objective in the sense that it exists outside of us and reaches us from without. The objective conditions generate various needs and desires, set goals and purposes, stimulate men to action, and generally produce the means by which they themselves may be changed. Every action arises from objective conditions and strives to change them by transcending the given state of society. The measure of its failure and success depends upon the circumstances in which action takes place. There was not the slightest doubt in Marx's mind that there might be a wide gap between what people desire and strive to achieve on the one hand and the objective possibilities in the given situation on the other. No society can surmount the barrier standing in the path of its development by a sort of salto mortale. It has to clear them in turn, one by one, and no bargains with history are possible on that score. Footnote. This is the first formulation of the famous dictum about the birth pangs of a new society and capital. End footnote. I don't know if I said that was a footnote, but footnote, end footnote. This seems to be the rational element in the Hegelian method of which Marx wrote to Engels upon glancing again through Hegel's Science of Logic in 1858. Freed from its speculative embellishments, it is too little to deserve the name of a method, for it is not a set of rules for the validation of scientific statements, nor is it, as Engels claimed in Anti-Düring, a set of rules intended to help us in scientific inquiry and discovery. It is at most a general directive based on the assumption that social systems change spontaneously, the change arising from the interaction of the parts of such systems and the interaction being conceived as wide as to include all forms of conflicts. The directive itself recommends the use of this assumption in the approach to and the investigation of social and historical facts. The general directive could only be developed into a method if some specific rules of procedure were added, and the directive itself served as criterion for deciding as to whether a specific rule of procedure is or is not part of the method. We cannot discover, however, such specific rules in Marx. It is misleading, therefore, to speak of the Marxian dialectical method if the term method is used in the term method's proper sense. The dialectical method of Marx is something that may merely be talked about but not applied. The Hegelizing interpreters of Marx often speak of Marx's masterly use of the dialectical method and of the inability of other people to grasp it, but they never state explicitly which of Marx's procedures they have in mind, and how and to what particular problem Marx applied it. They seem to perform some kind of ceremonial ritual whose origin and meaning are forgotten, but which is cherished by the worshippers. The Hegelizing interpreters are satisfied with repeating certain traditionally accepted utterances, although the Hegelizing interpreters would be hard put to explain what these traditionally accepted utterances mean and imply. Engels defended Marx against Düring's criticism, according to which Marx just the inevitable self-annihilation of the capitalist formation by means of the Hegelian negation of the negation. Every attentive reader of Capital will agree with Engels that Marx first established certain trends in contemporary capitalism on the basis of historical and economic fact, and then, in addition, described these trends in terms of the Hegelian dialectical law. Engels then proceeds to point out the difference between a method of analysis or discovery and that of validation, between the method of inquiry and that of presentation, to restate the same in Marxian terms, and insisted that Marxian dialectics is a method of discovery and not of validation. We should infer from these distinctions, which Engels, perhaps prompted by Marx himself, so strongly emphasized, that whatever is discovered by following the Marxian dialectical directive is not valid knowledge until it is established independently by the accepted rules of scientific procedure. As Labriola put it, Marxian dialectics is neither an instrument of research nor a method of proof, quote, but only a comprehensive formula, valid indeed, but post factum, end quote. Antonio Labriola, Socialism and Philosophy. This is, however, a conception of the relationship between dialectics and scientific procedure, toto coelho, different from that adopted by Engels himself and later firmly established in Marxism-Leninism. According to the Engelsian and Marxist-Leninist conceptions, it is not dialectics that is subordinated to scientific method, but vice versa. While in the case of Marx, dialectics does not require the abandonment of scientific method, but on the contrary presupposes scientific method's validity and observance, the approach of Engels and Marxist-Leninists reduces scientific method to a subordinate role and imposes restrictions upon its application and validity. Section 5. The Hegelian Revival in the Philosophy of Engels. Hegel's influence upon Engels was incomparably wider and more decisive than it was upon Marx. Marx approached Hegel critically, followed Hegel's conceptions selectively, and modified considerably the views adopted from Hegel in order to make them suit his theoretical purpose. Engels' attitude to Hegel was marked not by a critical spirit, but by a feeling of devotion and piety. He borrowed from Hegel without discrimination, and what he took over he incorporated sometimes even in its original formulation. Numerous passages in Anti-Düring and Dialectics of Nature are merely summaries of views to be found in Hegel. Footnote. To give one telling example, Hegel's assertion in Philosophy of Nature that, quote, there is no motion without matter, so also there is no matter without motion, end quote, is reproduced by Engels in the statement, quote, matter without motion is just as inconceivable as motion without matter, end quote, which is in Anti-Düring and Dialectics of Nature. End footnote. End footnote. It was Engels' boundless admiration for, quote, Hegel's discoveries in the sphere of dialectics, end quote, that produced the Dialectics of Nature as a constitutive principle of the universe. Engels was convinced that once the Hegelian logic is stated in a simple and clear language, the dialectical method becomes, quote, the only true form of development of thought, end quote. Engels. He not only adopted the Hegelian logic of dialectics, but also borrowed practically all illustrations of the Hegelian logic of dialectics from Hegel's various works. Engels took over Hegel's theories lock, stock, and barrel without questioning Hegel's theory's validity and scientific character. Among the numerous conceptions of Hegel to be found in Engels, Hegel's view on the relation of philosophy to science and his distinction between the metaphysical and dialectical modes of thought are most important. They open the gate through which the Hegelian philosophy flooded Marxian philosophy, or to be more precise, what Engels presented as Marxian philosophy and what, on his authority, has been accepted as such ever since. Engels' conception of the relation of natural science to philosophy is purely Hegelian. Quote, "There is a fundamental delusion in all scientific empiricism," end quote, wrote Hegel. Scientific imperialism employs some definite metaphysical categories such as matter, force, infinity, and so forth, but, quote, "all the while empiricism is unaware that empiricism contains metaphysics," end quote. It is impossible to think and to escape metaphysics. Consequently, only animals are mere physicists, for animals alone do not think. Man, being a thinking being, is a born metaphysician. Quote, "The real question," end quote, Hegel asserted, expressing a thought which Marxism-Leninism has taken hold of, quote, "is not whether we shall apply metaphysics, but whether our metaphysics is of the right kind," end quote. Hegel. Empiricism, and generally in Hegel's words, quote, "the abstract non-philosophical method of the sciences," end quote, adopts, quote, "one-sided forms of thought," end quote, and makes these rigidly fixed categories the basis of its theoretical examination. While priding itself on being free from speculation, it contains metaphysics of the worst kind and becomes, quote, "the quintessence of shallow thinking," end quote. Hegel. For this reason, Hegel considered Hegel's own speculative philosophy, which was openly and uncritically metaphysical, superior to all philosophy of common sense. This is also the point made by Engels, quote, "Natural scientists may adopt whatever attitude natural scientists please. Natural scientists are still under the domination of philosophy. It is only a question whether natural scientists want to be dominated by a bad, fashionable philosophy, or by a form of theoretical thought which rests on acquaintance with the theory of thought and its achievements," end quote. Engels. Hegelian philosophy became dominant in Engels' mind not only because Hegelian philosophy provided a basis for theoretical thought, which as Engels felt was extremely fruitful for acquiring new knowledge, but also because Hegel alone was able to show conclusively the superiority of his own system over other philosophies. The decisiveness of this demonstration was based on Hegel's discovery of the temporality of philosophy. The true significance of Hegelian philosophy lay in the fact that Hegelian philosophy, quote, "once for all dealt the death blow to the finality of all products of human thought and action," end quote. Truth could be discovered only in the historical development of knowledge, which advances constantly but never reaches the ultimate goal. The philosophy of Hegel reveals that everything is transitory. The only enduring thing is the uninterrupted process of becoming and passing away, of gradually ascending from lower to the higher stages of development, a process which is reflected in the progress of scientific knowledge and of philosophy as its crowning achievement. The support given to Hegel's criticism of empirical knowledge and Hegel's, quote, "philosophical science," end quote, based on speculative thought, pushed Engels in the direction which ultimately led Engels to the subordination of scientific knowledge to metaphysical fancies. The subordination of scientific knowledge to metaphysical fancies. That's not in italics, I just think that's important. While Engels insisted that we should start with facts and not with preconceived ideas, his mind was dominated by a priori metaphysical conceptions concerning the reality underlying observed phenomena and concealed behind appearance. With Engels, as with every metaphysician, the concealed reality was more real than any particular thing. Although Engels was genuinely convinced that he followed scientific procedures in discarding appearances for the sake of the concealed reality, the metaphysical element in Engels' thought played havoc with his positivistic leanings. Engels tried to base empirical science on the theoretical foundations of philosophy, a philosophy, which called in question the truth of empirical science and which was inspired by a distrust of empiricism. Engels' partiality to Hegel was destined to produce disastrous consequences for the school of philosophy which Engels helped to establish. To accept the view that a metaphysician or a Naturphilosoph is in possession of knowledge superior to scientific knowledge is to hold a belief both false and harmful. For the view that a metaphysician or a Naturphilosoph is in possession of knowledge superior to scientific knowledge provides a convenient justification for imposing restrictions on scientific inquiry, which is precisely what happened in the Soviet Union. The Hegelian distinction between metaphysics and dialectics was first introduced by Engels in his review of a contribution to the critique of political economy. Engels elaborated the distinction in the introductory chapter of Anti-Düring and commented upon the distinction between metaphysics and dialectics throughout the work, Anti-Düring. In Ludwig Feuerbach, the distinction between metaphysics and dialectics comes up again, but only marginally. In Dialectics of Nature, the Hegelian distinction between metaphysics and dialectics provides the main vantage point from which the whole field of contemporary science and philosophy is critically viewed. Most of the content of Dialectics of Nature was written after the publication of Anti-Düring in the years 1878 to 82, which corroborates the opinion that Engels' allegiance to Hegel was unswerving and immune to the passage of time. To establish conclusively the Hegelian origin not only of the distinction between the metaphysical and dialectical modes of thought, but also their ramifications, also their various ramifications, which brought along whole clusters of Hegelian ideas into the Engelsian, Leninist, and Stalinist interpretation of Marxian philosophy, it is necessary to describe the Hegelian distinction between the philosophy of understanding on the one hand and the philosophy of dialectical and speculative reason on the other. Only on this basis can the extent and scope of the Hegelian infiltration be fully appreciated. According to Hegel, there are three aspects, or quote, moments, end quote, momente, or moment, in logically real, that is, ontologically valid thought. Hegel describes them as understanding, negative or dialectical reason, and positive or speculative reason. The distinction between understanding, Verstand, and reason, Vernunft, comes from Kant, but Hegel gave the distinction between understanding, Verstand, and reason, Vernunft, a different meaning and endowed the two modi of thought, for dialectical and speculative reason, can be combined into one single modus, as was usually done by Hegel, with entirely different cognitive functions. According to Hegel, Kant in his critique of reason never really went beyond the critique of understanding in the Hegelian sense of the term understanding. Understanding is thought acting in thought's analytical capacity, as it apprehends empirically given, isolated, and only externally related objects, in those objects specific differences, these differences being, quote, finite, that is, fixed and independent of one another. Understanding adopts the maxim of the heterogeneity of real objects. Quote, everything is essentially distinct, end quote, and follows the laws of identity, of non-contradiction, and of the excluded middle. Although it is anxious to avoid contradiction, regarding it as, quote, an accident, a kind of abnormality, normality, or paroxysm of sickness, end quote, it is bound to fail in this endeavor. In Hegel's opinion, which distorts and misrepresents Kant's real purpose, Kant demonstrated that philosophy based on the principles of formal logic unavoidably leads to antinomies, thereby dealing a mortal blow to the belief in the fitness of understanding in philosophy. Since understanding is based on, quote, immediate sense perception and the play of fancy, end quote, understanding produces concepts adequate only to distinct delimited entities and fixed relations between those distinct delimited entities. Understanding yields thinking which is shallow, abstract, and non-philosophical in making use of concepts unreflectingly accepted. This type of thinking prevails in everyday life, in science, and in common sense and empirical philosophy as represented by Locke or Hume. Hegel emphasized time and again that the philosophy of mere understanding is not the path on which philosophical truth can be found, for the philosophy of mere understanding is undisciplined, as Hegel said, by, quote, proper philosophical reflection, end quote. Thought, as it's at its dialectical stage, comprehends the very, quote, finite characteristic, end quote, is self-contradictory and thus involves its own, quote, self-suppression, end quote. Every characteristic X, considered as fixed, is one-sided and requires that characteristic X's opposite, negative X, by which X is defined and determined. Quote, by dialectics is meant the indwelling tendency outwards, by which the one-sidedness and limitation of the predicates of understanding is seen in its true light, and shown to be the negation of them. For anything to be finite is just to suppress itself and put itself aside. End quote. Hegel. According to Hegel, everything contains everything's negation, owing to which it is linked with its opposite and must become what it is not. This negativity and contradictoriness are an essential characteristic of being, ignored by understanding and apprehended only by dialectical reason. While thought, at its dialectical stage, is able to see that, quote, finite characteristics, end quote, requires their opposites, it does not grasp the unity of all opposites. Only thought as positive and speculative reason comprehends the ground, i.e. the unity of identity and difference, and affirms the immanent connection of characteristics opposed to each other, their mutual relatedness and their transition into one another, which lie beyond the compass of understanding. Speculative philosophy, Hegel explained elsewhere, consists in the comprehension of the unity of opposites and in the application of this knowledge in a systematic way. Reason is the capacity of thought to transcend the, quote, either-or, end quote, mode of thinking, and to recognize the unity, the difference, and the identity of opposites which, according to the understanding, are incompatible with each other. The philosophy of speculative reason endeavors to ascertain the, quote, inner unity of all existence, end quote, and in the words of the phenomenology of mind, quote, to recognize in what seems conflicting and inherently antagonistic the presence of mutually necessary moments, end quote. This implies that, quote, the principle of identity, end quote, has to be rejected and replaced by the, quote, principle of contradiction, end quote. Logic of speculative reason differs basically from, quote, logic in the ordinary sense, end quote, which is a product of understanding. It is a matter and advanced form of logic that evolves through the criticism of the, quote, older, end quote, or, quote, former metaphysics, end quote, and takes its place as, quote, the scientific reconstruction of the world, to be built of thoughts alone, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Reason pierces through the schematic conceptions of understanding. Reason recognizes that everything is not only identical with, but also different from, itself. That everything is and is not what those things appear to be. And that everything is subject to the ontological law of contradiction. Quote, all things are contradictory in themselves, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic, Volume 2. Although the term, quote, understanding, end quote, has in Hegel a depreciatory meaning as, quote, speculative reason, end quote, and appreciatory one, Hegel did not deny that the, quote, merits and rights of the mere understanding should unhesitatingly be admitted, end quote. Hegel: neither common sense nor philosophy, neither theory nor practice, neither science nor art can proceed without understanding. But it is dialectics that is the, quote, soul of all knowledge which is truly scientific, end quote. And it is dialectics and not understanding that is, quote, an ultimate, end quote. Hegel: while understanding constitutes a stage in the development of thought, it is a stage at which philosophy should not stand still forever. This is, however, what happened in the philosophy which had prevailed in Germany prior to Kant, and which Hegel called, quote, the former, or, quote, older metaphysics, die Formalige Metaphysik, that is, quote, metaphysics of understanding, end quote, Verstandesmetaphysik. The old metaphysics can be said to belong to the past only in the sense that it preceded the critical philosophy of Kant and Hegel's philosophy of speculative reason historically. Otherwise, Hegel explained, quote, the thing is always and at all places to be found as the view which the abstract understanding takes of the objects of reason, end quote. Hegel: the old metaphysics is a philosophy of understanding. This accounts for its limitations and defects. For understanding is a philosophically inadequate mode of thinking. The old metaphysics, as described by Hegel, is based on the assumption that the determinations of abstract thought are the essential determinations of things, and that knowledge is acquired by the assignment of predicates. Hegel maintained that the main problem for pre-Kantian metaphysics was to discover whether a given predicate should or should not be attributed to an object or a class of objects. Each of these predicates was believed, quote, valid by itself, end quote. It was cut off from its, quote, connection and solidarity, end quote, with its opposite, and everything was alleged to have one or the other of the mutually exclusive predicates. Categories, quote, separated from each other, end quote, absolutely firm, end quote, with those categories extension drawn by hard and fast lines and supposed to be, quote, permanently fixed, end quote, or merely, quote, finite, end quote, and inadequate predicates. As Hegel put it, instead of expressing the truth, they only impose a limit. That is, they differentiate the things in their immutability and identity by excluding contraries. This means, however, that the philosophy of understanding does not rise above the immediate data of consciousness, is satisfied with its half-truths, and fails to discover the way of access to reality. To use Heinrich Richter's simile, Heinrich Richter, I believe, being a neo-Kantian, however small and fine, let me just make sure I'm not talking on my ass. Hopefully my internet's working. Probably not, though. It might be working, I don't know, it's being very slow. To use Heinrich Richter's simile, however, small and fine may be the meshes of the conceptual network formed by the method of understanding. Reality, which knows no sharp boundaries and is in constant flux, is bound to flow between and through these meshes without being apprehended. The philosophy of understanding was to be found above all in metaphysics, in such systems as those of Descartes, Spinoza, or Wolff, which Hegel mentioned by name as instances of it. These systems were constructed by means of deductive, quasi-mathematical methods, which, quote, however indispensable and brilliantly successful in their province, end quote, are as a matter of course, quote, unserviceable for philosophical cognition, end quote. The suitability of the deductive method in philosophy is due to the fact that it cannot do without axioms, without uncritically accepted presuppositions, and above all that its procedure conforms to the, quote, canon of formal identity, end quote. The deductive method, held up as a model of perfection before philosophy, is based upon the distinctiveness and definiteness of concepts. the independence and consistency of axioms, the unambiguity and permanence of deductive rules, which are all instruments of understanding and of its adequate and unsatisfactory mode of philosophical thinking. Casual philosophical reflections and less systematic ways of deductive reasoning to be found in philosophical arguments called by Hegel, quote, Resonierungen, shared with the deductive method its defects and limitations. Footnote, see W.T. Stace, The Philosophy of Hegel. Some contemporary exponents of Hegel's philosophy have voiced the opinion that Hegel's objections to the, quote, older metaphysics, end quote, would also apply to all kinds of positivism, to analytical and linguistic philosophy and logical empiricism, for they too clearly exemplify a philosophy of understanding. The procedure peculiar to this kind of philosophy reveals the poverty of its purpose by accepting uncritically the knowledge provided by understanding, and by understanding, The procedure peculiar to this kind of philosophy reveals the poverty of its purpose by accepting uncritically the knowledge provided by understanding, and by its failure to transcend the given reality. Speculative philosophy, philosophy tout court in Hegel's sense, must scorn these defective methods if it wishes to attain knowledge with any spiritual significance and truth in it. Hegel contrasted the analytic or deductive procedures used in the philosophy of understanding with the dialectical method of speculative philosophy. This dialectical method is supposed to help the thinker to discover the process by which categories of thought give rise to each other. It is the general principle of the dialectical method that, quote, negation is just as much affirmation as negation, end quote, or that each category contains its opposite and what it is not. Thus, for instance, we should recognize that the idea of pure being contains the idea of nothing, that being and nothing are not only different but also identical, and that the one passes into the other. In Hegel's own words, quote, in fact being ... is nothing, neither more nor less ... Nothing is the same determination or lack of determination, and thus altogether the same thing as pure being, end quote. Hegel. The assertion is justified by the rejection of the law of non-contradiction and the acceptance of existent, quote, contradiction, end quote. That everything contains, quote, both being and nothing, end quote, is a primary truth of speculative philosophy, one that needs no elucidation or justification. The, quote, existent contradiction, end quote, being itself and something else in the same respect and at the same time, compels us to search for another category combining and reconciling the characteristics of being and nothing. Since a thing is and is not at the same time when that thing is becoming, the third category which resolves the contradiction of being and nothing is becoming. The mode of thought characteristic of positive reason does not imply, therefore, that, quote, reason is in contradiction with reason's self, end quote. But the recognition of the existence of contradiction lifts reason above the limitations of understanding and reveals a truth hidden from it, end quote. Hegelian dialectics is apparently not a method by which we deduce categories from each other, but one by which categories deduce themselves. As Hegel put it in Science of Logic, Hegel did not really follow the method in his system, but rather his system followed its own method. We always apply the triple rhythm, for we first discover how an affirmative category produces that affirmative category's own contradiction of that affirmative category's self, and then how the two categories jointly produce out of themselves the third. The third category contains and transcends the first two contradictory ideas of the triad from which this third category has arisen. Footnote: see W.T. Stace, The Philosophy of Hegel. Hegel claimed that a correct dialectical transition from one notion to another notion is necessary. That is, the correct dialectical transition from one notion to another notion could not be accomplished. Hegel claimed that a correct dialectical transition from one notion to another is necessary, that it could not be accomplished otherwise, and that dialectics, being a method of discovery, is at the same time one of infallible rigor. Quote, I know, end quote, Hegel wrote, quote, that it is the only true method, end quote, the only method capable of, quote, securing scientific progress, end quote. The dialectical development follows a, quote, resistless course, free from all foreign elements, admitting nothing from outside, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Every dialectical step implies one and only one dialectically valid continuation, which reveals the necessary interconnection of ideas. The dialectical method is a reflection of objective or external dialectics. That is, the dialectical process, die Dialectik, as distinct from subjective thinking, which applies the rules of dialectics to some subject matter. Quote, I call dialectics, end quote, Hegel explained, quote, the concept's moving principle, end quote. The development of the concept out of the concept self, in the course of which the concept engenders the concept's determinations. Thinking as something merely subjective looks on, as it were, at this development, and does not add to it anything of its own. Quote, the sole task of philosophic science is to bring into consciousness this proper work of the reason of the thing itself, end quote. Come on, man. I don't know what's going on with my computer today, but it's being uncooperative. Objective dialectics is like an elemental force which is at work, quote, whenever there is movement, whenever there is life, whenever anything is carried into effect in the actual world, end quote. Everything that surrounds us, Hegel wrote, may be regarded as, quote, an instance of dialectics, end quote. For everything finite, quote, instead of being stable and ultimate, is rather changeable and transient, end quote. We say, for instance, that man is mortal, which appears to imply that man's mortality is due to some outward circumstances. But the truth of the matter is that life involves the germ of death, and that the finite involves its own suppression. Thus we have a vision of, quote, dialectics as the universal and irresistible power before which nothing can stay, however secure and stable it may deem itself, end quote. Hegel. Objective dialectics has objective dialectics' origin in the negativity of being, the conversion of Spinoza's proposition, quote, all negation is determination, end quote, or, quote, negation is inherent in the essence of positive being, end quote, is Hegel's basic ontological axiom. The state of privation or deficiency generates tension and pressure and induces the tendency in all things to realize those things' potentialities and to overcome those things' imperfection. The negativity of being becomes manifest in the dialectical process as contradiction, and contradiction turns out to be an essential and universal form of reality. The dialectical process is the unfolding of the contradiction inherent in every object, and in the course of which things change into their opposites. Contradiction is the universal force impelling change and progress. To silence any objection to his extraordinary discovery and any doubt as to its validity, Hegel curtly announced that, quote, With regard to the assertion that contradiction does not exist, we may disregard this statement, end quote. Although it is commonly accepted that it is impossible to think anything contradictory, the very opposite is true. All things are contradictory objects, quote, the contradiction being present in them and not merely in an external reflection, end quote. Contradiction is, quote, the root of all movement and life, end quote, and all motion is nothing but, quote, existent contradiction itself, end quote. To say all this is to express a profound and essential truth about things. Hegel claimed that he understood what all these statements meant, but his claim is of course open to doubt. It is clear that Engels' distinction between the metaphysical and the dialectical mode of thought reproduces Hegel's differentiation between understanding and dialectical and positive reason. Not only the distinction, but also the description of the two modes of thinking is expressed in the Hegelian terminology. Finally, the conclusion which Engels draws from his differentiation and which provides Engels with his conceptual framework for the analysis of philosophical and scientific knowledge are purely Hegelian. Plekhanov was the first follower of Marx who was fully aware that Engels' distinction between metaphysics and dialectics was a paraphrase of Hegel, that Engels' dialectics corresponds to Hegel's speculative philosophy, that is, to metaphysics in the traditional sense, that, quote, the former metaphysics, end quote, of Hegel and metaphysics in Engels' sense included any philosophy, whether idealist or materialist, which adhered to the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of identity. Oh my god, my computer hates me today. It wants to put a knife in me. Come on, dude. Where the hell am I? Plekhanov seemed also to have been aware of the fact that Engels' use of the term, quote, metaphysics, end quote, conformed to Hegel's use of the term metaphysics and was at variance with Marx's, to be found, for instance, in The Holy Family. Footnote. For instance, Marx contrasted Locke's philosophy of common sense, that is, metaphysics in Hegel's and Engels' meaning of the term, with the, quote, 17th century metaphysics, end quote, of Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and Malebranche, which Marx described as the, quote, mere bungling of fancy and theological prejudice, end quote. Marx also said that, quote, 17th century metaphysics, was given a victorious and solid restoration in German philosophy, particularly in speculative German philosophy of the 19th century, end quote, and spoke of a, quote, metaphysical universal kingdom, end quote, found in Hegel. Hegel's speculative philosophy was surely metaphysics in Marx's sense and had, contrary to what Hegel thought, nothing to do with, quote, scientific procedure in philosophy, end quote. Hegel's speculative philosophy and Engels' end footnote. Hegel's speculative philosophy and Engels' dialectics are clearly metaphysics in Marx's sense. The metaphysician in Engels' sense, whom Engels identified historically with a supporter either of the Wolffian or of the, quote, old metaphysics, end quote, is Hegel's, quote, philosopher of understanding, end quote. Just as his Hegelian model, he considers things in isolation, apart from each other, and from their connection with the vast whole, he being the metaphysician. Just as the metaphysician in Engels, just as the metaphysician in the Hegelian model. Sorry, I'm fucking up here. The metaphysician in Engels' sense, whom Engels identified historically with a supporter either of Wolffian or of the, quote, old metaphysics, end quote, is Hegel's, quote, philosopher of understanding, end quote. Just as his Hegelian model, he considers things in isolation, apart from each other, and from their connection with the vast whole. He conceives them as objects, quote, fixed, not Engels, the metaphysician in Engels' sense. The metaphysician in Engels' sense conceives them as objects, quote, fixed, rigid, given once and for all, end quote, as constant, not as essentially variable, quote, in response, not in motion, in their death, not in life. End quote. Quote, he thinks in absolutely irreconcilable antitheses. His communication is, quote, yeah, nay, nay, end quote, for whatever is more than these cometh of evil. For him a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in a rigid antithesis one to the other, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Engels' metaphysician follows in the footsteps of Hegel's philosopher of understanding, adopts his maxim, quote, everything is essentially distinct, end quote, recognizes the ordinary logic which its laws of identity, non-contradiction, and of the excluded middle forgets that things change and move and are alive. Like Hegel, Engels concedes that the metaphysical mode of thought is, quote, justifiable and necessary, end quote, within certain limits, but beyond them, quote, becomes one-sided, restricted, abstract, lost in insoluble contradictions, end quote. Reality, with its wealth of continuous differentiation, eludes every concept or system of concepts established by the metaphysical method of concept formation, which is a manner of thinking that suits only sound common sense and is adequate for everyday purposes. It may, as Hegel would say, reach, quote, formal truth, bare correctness, end quote. What Hegel called, quote, truth in the deeper sense, end quote, cannot, however, be discovered by means of Engels' metaphysical mode of thought. For this, the methods of dialectics, the correlate of Hegel's speculative philosophy, are necessary. According to Engels, it is the dialectical mode of thought which, like the dialectical and speculative philosophy of Hegel, comprehends things and their representations and their essential connections, concatenations, motion, origin, and ending. End quote. Therefore, the methods of dialectics are indispensable in natural science, for, quote, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, end quote, in the investigation of the universe as a whole and of its evolution, of the development of man and his conception about himself and the world in which he lives. The dialectical method of thinking is indispensable for apprehending any process of becoming and passing away, of change, transformation, and development. That this is exactly what Hegel said when Hegel claimed that the dialectical method is required, quote, whenever there is movement, whenever there is life, whenever anything is carried into effect in the actual world, end quote. Engels followed Hegel in his insistence that the comprehension of motion, change, and life demands the rejection of the, quote, principle of identity, end quote, and its replacement by the, quote, principle of contradiction, end quote. It was Hegel's opinion that formal logic obstructs the understanding of the dynamics of development. For these dynamics are provided by, quote, negativity in its essential determination, ... which consists of nothing else but an exhibition of contradiction, end quote. Engels is in full agreement with this opinion. Motion, change, life are a contradiction or involve a contradiction. It is the, quote, objective presence, end quote, of a contradiction in things and processes themselves that supply them with a, quote, actual force, end quote, and makes them move, change, and live. This is Hegel again with his all-pervading contradiction and the dialectics of negativity. and moving and germinating principle of the phenomenology of mind so much admired by Marx in his youth. The dialectics of negativity gives rise to the, quote, inherent pulsation of self-movement, end quote, and is the source of all change, development, and progress, including the progress of speculative reason. Finally, there are the dialectical laws, which are the, quote, general laws of all motion, just as valid for motion in nature and human history as for the motion of thought, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. The dialectical principle, said Hegel, in the dialectical principle's true and proper character constitutes, quote, the life and soul of scientific progress, the dynamic which alone gives immanent connection and necessity to the body of science, end quote. It is the dialectical principle that helps to discover the, quote, real and true, end quote, as opposed to the external and finite. It is Engels' firmly established view that dialectics provides superior knowledge unobtainable by other means. Dialectics cannot be despised with impunity, without science being led into errors, superstitions, and barren speculations. It is a, quote, absolute necessity, end quote, for natural science, for it is the sole method. Dialectics is the sole method of thought appropriate to the present outlook on nature. Dialectics is a, quote, method of arriving at new results, end quote, extending the, quote, narrow horizon, end quote, of metaphysical thought. Dialectics, quote, contains the germ of a more comprehensive view of the world, end quote. Engels, Anti-During. Generally speaking, dialectics is the science of interconnection, in contrast to metaphysics, which is the knowledge of things considered in isolation. The universal interconnection is expressed in three laws: the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, the law of the interpretation of opposites, and the law of negation of the negation. All three, Engels emphasized, were discovered and developed by Hegel, from whose work Engels also appropriated practically all their instances. Footnote. Engels' example of one grain of barley, which by the negation of the negation produces many grains, is clearly inspired by Hegel's divagations on the flower being a refutation of the bud, and the fruit is a negation of the blossom. The hell is a divagation? Yeah, before when I was looking something up, my computer's cooperating. Heinrich Rickert was a leading neo-Kantian. I was right about that. Divagate means to wander or stray from a course or subject, diverge or digress. Anyway, end footnote, back to the text. Come on. You know what I clicked. Hegel's error was in foisting these laws on nature and history as laws of thought instead of deducing these laws from nature and history. It was enough, however, to, quote, turn the thing around, end quote, which meant, if we are to judge from Dialectics of Nature, to present Hegel's laws as the most general laws of the universe, and to illustrate them with some examples from physics, chemistry, and biology. To make everything, quote, become simple and clear as noonday, end quote. That quote's from Dialectics of Nature by Engels. Engels was clearly looking at the world through the eyes of the, quote, great dialectician, end quote. This is not intended to imply that Engels wanted to take credit for the ideas of another, that Engels tried to appear in borrowed plumes. A much more plausible explanation is Engels' intellectual helplessness with respect to Hegel's ability to deceive himself and others and his exaggerated view of the significance of Hegel's philosophy. In Engels' Philosophical Innocence, Engels applied to Hegel's system one of Hegel's basic philosophical ideas expounded in detail in Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy, namely that there is an imminent necessity in the historical sequence of philosophical systems. Philosophical systems are, quote, moments of an organic unity, end quote, and their diversity reflects the progressive evolution of philosophical truth. In particular, Engels adopted the Hegelian idea that the last system of an epoch synthesizes, or to put it in Hegelian language, supersedes, Aufheben, that is, overcomes and preserves all previous stages of philosophical development and constitutes its crowning phase. With Hegel, Engels wrote, philosophy comes to an end, first because in his own system Hegel summed up the whole development of philosophy, and second, because Hegel showed that the task of philosophy is no longer the construction of systems, but the pursuance of truths supplied by the positive sciences and the, quote, summation of their results by means of dialectical thinking, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels did not see the Hegelian philosophy for what it was, a monster of speculative metaphysics in the very height of extravagant abstraction, as Marx described it, but construed it as the final phase in the necessary line of philosophical development to be recognized by every philosopher worthy of his name. Incredible as it may seem, the Hegelian system meant for Engels the end of speculation and the beginning of scientific philosophy. The end of the evolution of dialectical materialism, a philosophical and sociological analysis by Z.A. Jordan. Thank you for listening.